reaches its zenith in Henri Bergson, of whom Deleuze has a lot of background in. He started with him early in his career. He wrote a book on Bergsonianism, which was a critique of vitalism. And secondly, Bergson plays heavily in the introduction to the cinema book, first book, Cinema Image, Image Thought, the 2 volumes on cinema. So Bergson's thesis about matter and movement, which I think Deleuze is, again, looking at Merleau-Ponty in this context, but that's another course for the future. Merleau-Ponty's influence on Gilles Deleuze and others, And anyway, the second moment, of course, is the mechanistic philosophy, that plays out in the materialist tradition with Lamaitre and de Holbach, and even earlier, of course, in the Cartesian moment in the 17th century, what we sometimes refer to as Cartesian mechanism and the old mind-body dualism, how this plays out. So anyway, a mechanical materialism is also at stake. So those 2 movements these are attempted to be, to be overwritten, overcoded, if you will, in a sense. And this is important to keep in mind because a lot of their vocabulary at some levels is very grounded in a kind of philosophical, tradition and what they both come out of. And, and especially in the French scene, where there are these antagonists always going on. Leon Brunschwig, in the academy was one of the major Cartesians and actually the dean of French philosophy for many years until Louis Althusser came along and kind of took over that moment. And this was a real refreshing moment in the 1960s. Although you could say that the early Hegelian moment of Jean Hippolyte and of course Kojel's subterranean lectures were another way of overcoming academic philosophy in France, which was heavily Cartesian. So, but I'll go over this more next week. I think tonight we should take a look at the introduction to schizoid analysis. Again, they are relentless in their attack upon holy familialism. Once again, the position of the paranoiac is very important. I'm looking forward to some commentary on that. The paranoiac is kind of crucial to fascist desire. You begin to see this with the Trump forces right now. You can actually see this kind of libidinal social field playing out with the Lynn Cheney case on the right wing currently. You begin to see this working, how the reinvestment of the paranoid desire happens in the social field of the traditional. And anyway, and then the opposition that Deleuze and Guattari are working with is delirium, and the artists that they go to, and they make claims, and I'm sure you picked up on this, that D.H. Lawrence and Henry Miller knew much more about sexuality than Sigmund Freud. And they kind of go that way, in those flows. And they'll, of course, mention American literature as being, especially the literature of the beats. There's a very, very strong relationship, literary relationship between Gilles Deleuze and William Burroughs, of course, as well, around the societies of control. And Burroughs did say psychoanalysis is not for heroin addicts, or for recovery. Yeah, so he did mention that, and he actually, had some access to grind there as well. So I want to point out these things. The artists play a lot out here. The French tradition and philosophy between vitalism and mechanism and play out, as well as, again, the attack. I tried to find the passage. I don't know if you mentioned, I got out my critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, Marx's great reading. This is, again, a great exercise in reading one of Marx's best in terms of the analytic force. I couldn't find the passage where Deleuze and Guattari are referring to, but I'll look harder. I thought I knew where it was, but I haven't picked it up yet. But amazing to look at again at this. Maybe I'll find it during the course of the evening, or I can shoot out an email or put it up on the website if I locate it. But this is another thing they do speak to this notion of Marx understanding sexuality despite his miserable, attempts in terms of with sexuality. So this is kind of interesting in many ways how this was working out. So anyway, and I also found I recommend. I think it's in English. If you want an excellent lines of this book. So again, it's a reference system. But anyway, last week we left it at Adam Smith and Freud. We're now trying to get to the two positive. They really again want to be with the history of the social field and the socius as primary again, right? Not the familial or the familial unit, etc. Continuing along the line that they have been developed throughout this attack upon the Holy Family, the daddy, mommy, me, triangulation, etc. So I don't know if anybody wants to say anything before we go on to the text or any particular passages. I know we work pretty well by focusing on passages. I think it's a very rich section again. I reread some of the part 3. I think that's very significant. I had some notes about that. To me, the Urstadt is crucial, the foundation of the Urstadt, something that they think Marx and the Marxists have missed completely, never been able to explain the transition, if you will, from the savage, from the wild, if you will, from the nomadic hunters to that of the barbarian despotic machine into their civilized, capitalist state. So I think this is also very, very important to keep that in mind, that section on the Urstadt, to me, is one of the most original advances in this book. And beginning here, I like their aspect of cinema. I don't know how many, Josh and I were speaking a minute ago, and Matt, about the cinematic field as a global field of coextension. And this is kind of where they begin in their introduction to psychoanalysis, that cinema is it, and the reference is to the larger than life, bigger than life film of Nicholas Ray, made in the 1950s. I don't know if it's anybody seen it. James Mason, Barbara Rush. Yeah, it's an extraordinary film. It's much better than Death of a Salesman. Anyway, it's a very interesting story of a transformation. Someone who's given cortisone shots and is transformed in a completely different way. Anybody seen it?
It's on Criterion.
I'm sorry?
It's on the Criterion channel.
It is on the Criterion channel, yes. Yeah. You can get it for free if you pay the $11 a month, or you have good hackers or pirate capacities. Yeah, so so they begin there in many ways, and also the 3 aspects of regression, that they speak about, and that psychoanalysis, and they actually say this, has an absurd theory of fantasy, and maybe we can start there and maybe ask David, Jane, and other people about this, what they thought of this section too, about regression in the psychoanalytic field, what they think is, so there's a lot to work with here. So David, you want to say something about it? I mean, the truth is sexuality is everywhere. That's really their main point about this, attack, if you will, on psychoanalysis. Yeah, it's not something that is in the family or the dirty little secret in the family. It's everywhere. This is page 293. Yeah. But anyway, please, David. Yeah.
What I was just thinking as I was reading this, though, is there's something very compelling about the idea that there could or would be a collective fantasy. But it seems to me partly where they don't sort of get Freud, this is just my take on it, is like someone might in a group watch something, be it a pornographic or erotic film or a vision of a spaceship taking off or a movie about something like The Godfather. But I think for Freud, the idea is that there's really not a collective fantasy because it's really going to be so much more the individual history of the person and their psychodynamics that's going to create an individual fantasy, and that's where Freudianism takes off, is to say one person sees a rocket go up and thinks of an erection, another person thinks of a tragedy, another person thinks of a breast, another person thinks of a myriad number of things. I wasn't quite sure for them if I might have been misunderstanding what the notion of a collective fantasy is in their system. That they might be thinking of something really quite different, it occurred to me. What's your take, Michael?
Well, I'm gonna read, that section, if you will, if you don't mind. And I think the group fantasies for them, the collective precedes the familial, right? The collective is always already in the socius. There isn't the individual fantasy per se, right? I mean, it may be coming from the subject in the group, and I think this is a reading, and I think you're absolutely right in mentioning Freud. Group psychology or mass psychology and the analysis of the I self is probably a more literal translation of the German, right? So this is a reading of that, I think, alongside Wilhelm Reich's mass psychology of fascism. Yeah, this is going on in this section. And that's where their notion of group fantasy, group, identification is coming from. So I think this is an overhaul of that to a degree. Yeah, yeah. And but anyway, let me read this section, and we'll go back to collective fantasy. So this is on. It's for those of you that have the different edition than mine. It is about. It's in the molecular unconscious. It's way in the section, page 293. It's about 10 pages into the part 2 of the molecular consciousness. And the paragraph begins with, the truth is that sexuality is everywhere, right? Okay, this is their, I don't know, does everybody found that page? It's about 10 pages in. Okay, good. The way a bureaucrat fondles his records, a judge administers justice, a businessman causes money to circulate, the way the bourgeoisie fucks the proletariat, and so on. And there's no need to resort to metaphors any more than for the libido to go by the way of metamorphosis. Hitler got the fascist sexuality aroused, right? And, of course, Mel Brooks does a great job of making fun of that. It's springtime for Hitler in Germany. Mel Brooks understood this, maybe somewhat unconscious, but, maybe probably very consciously. I like Mel Brooks. Anyway, yeah, okay. So anyway, flags, nations, armies, banks get a lot of people aroused. A revolutionary machine is nothing. And remember, they're really trying to create here the revolutionary desire, or to think through revolutionary desire, oppositionally to the paranoid, is nothing if it does not acquire at least as much force as these coercive machines have for producing breaks and mobilizing flows. It is not through a desexualizing extension that the libido invests the large aggregates. On the contrary, it is through a restriction, a blockage, and a reduction that the libido is made to repress its flows in order to contain them in the narrow cells of the type couple, family, person, objects, And doubtless such a blockage is necessarily justified. Libido does not come to consciousness except in relation to a given body, a given person that it takes as object. But our object choice itself refers, and this is important, I think, David, to the whole thing that you're bringing up, refers to a conjunction of flows of life and of society that this body and this person intercept, receive, and transmit, always within a biological, social, and historical field where we are equally immersed or with which we communicate. The persons to whom our loves are dedicated, including the parental persons, intervene only as points of connections, of disjunction, of conjunctions, of flows, whose libidinal tenor of a properly unconscious investment they translate. Thus, no matter how well grounded the love blockage is, it curiously changes its function depending on whether it engages desire in the edible impasses of the couple and the family in the service of the repressive machines, or whether, on the contrary, it condenses a free energy investment or cathexis, right, capable of fueling a revolutionary machine. This is a crucial question to them. How do you fuel the revolutionary machine? Where's that energy cathexis, that energy investment? Here again, parentheses, everything has already been said by Fourier, Charles Fourier. I don't know if you noticed, they use Fourier a lot in this section, where he shows the two contrary directions of the captivation and mechanization of the passions. But we always make love with worlds. And Bruno, we should note this passage about the captivation of the passions, given our work on Laudon and others. Anyway,
right.
Yeah. And our love addresses itself to this libidinal property of our lover, or either close himself off or open up to a more spacious world, to masses and larger aggregates. There's always something statistical in our loves, and something belonging to the laws of large numbers. And isn't it in this way that we must understand the famous formula of Marx? The relationship between man and woman is the direct, natural, and necessary relation of person to person. That is, the relationship between the two sexes, man and woman, is only the measure of the relationship of sexuality in general, insofar as it invests large aggregates, man and man, question mark. Whence that came to be called the species determination of the sexuality of the two sexes. And must it not also be said that the phallus is not one sex, but sexuality in its entirety, which is to say that the sign of the large aggregate invested by the libido, whence the two sexes necessarily derive, both in their separation, the two homosexual series of man and man, and we go back to where we were earlier in terms of the incest relation, right? Woman and woman, and in their statistical relations within this aggregate, question mark. Then he go on, and I think this is the complicated part. Maybe we'll try to unpack this, and I'd love to hear people's thoughts on this. But Marx says something even more mysterious, and this is interesting. This is why I've been looking in the Hegel's critique of, Marx's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, that the true difference is not the difference between the two sexes, but the difference between the human sex and the non-human sex. It is clearly not a question of animals, not of animal sexuality. Something quite different is involved. If sexuality is the unconscious investment of the large molar aggregates, it is because on its other side, sexuality is identical with the interplay of the molecular elements that constitute these aggregates under determinate conditions. The dwarfism of desire, right, as a correlative to its gigantism. Sexuality and the desiring machines are one and the same inasmuch as these machines are present and operating in the social machines. In the field, their formation, their functioning. Desiring machines are the non-human sex. The molecular machinic elements, their arrangements, and their syntheses, without which there would be neither a human sex specifically determined in the larger aggregates, nor a human sexuality capable of investing these aggregates. In a few sentences, Marx, who is nonetheless so miserly and reticent where sexuality is concerned, exploded something that will hold Freud and all of psychoanalysis forever captive: the anthropomorphic representation of sex. Right? What we call anthropomorphic representation is just as much the idea that there are two sexes as the idea that there is only one. We know how Freudianism is permeated by the bizarre notion that there is finally only one sex, the masculine, in relation to which the woman, the feminine, is defined as lack and absence. So, of course, this goes through the classic, penis envy, etc. Right? It could be thought of at first that such a hypothesis founds the omnipotence of a male homosexuality. Yet this is not at all the case. What is founded here is rather the statistical aggregate of intersexual loves. This is interesting. Instead of intersectionality, intersexual loves, right? For if the woman is defined as a lack in relation to the man in his turn lacks what is lacking in the woman. Simply in another fashion, the idea of a single sex necessarily leads to the erection of a phallus as an object on high, which distributes lack as two non-superimposable sides and makes the two sexes communicate in a common absence, castration. Women, as psychoanalysis or psychoanalyzed, can then rejoice in showing man the way and in recuperating equality and difference, whence the irresistibly comical nature of the formulas according to which one gains access to desire through castration. And this, of course, is Lacan and, a Lacanian reading of Freud. But the idea that there are two sexes, after all, is no better. This time, like Melanie Klein, one attempts to define the female sex by means of positive characteristics, even if they be terrifying. At least in this sex, one avoids phallocentrism, if not anthropomorphism. But this time, far from founding the communication between the two sexes, one founds instead their separation into two homosexual series that remain statistical. And one does not by any means escape castration. It is simply that castration, instead of being the principle of sex conceived as the masculine sex, the great castrating, soaring phallus, becomes the result of sex conceived as the feminine sex, the little hidden absorbed penis. We maintain, therefore, that castration is the basis for the anthropomorphic and molar representation of sexuality. Castration is the universal belief that brings together and disperses both men and women under the yoke of one and the same illusion of consciousness and makes them adore this yoke. Every attempt to determine the non-human nature of sex, for example, the great other in Lacan, while conserving myth and castration, is defeated from the start. And what does Lyotard mean in his commentary, so profound nevertheless on Marx's text, when he sees the opening of the non-human, and this is another book of Lyotard's, The Inhuman. They're very close to Jean-François Lyotard, who's an incredibly intelligent man anyway, as having to be the entry of the subject into desire through castration. Long live castration so that desire may be strong, ? Only fantasies are truly desired. What a perverse human, all too human idea. An idea originating in bad conscience, again Nietzsche, right? And not in the unconscious. Anthropomorphic molar representation culminates in the very thing that founds it, the ideology, once again, of lack. The molecular unconscious, on the contrary, knows nothing of castration because partial objects lack nothing and form free multiplicities as such. Because the multiple breaks never cease producing flows instead of repressing them, cutting them at a single stroke, the only break capable of exhausting them. Because the synthesis constitute local and non-specific connections, inclusive disjunctions, nomadic conjunctions, everywhere a microscopic transsexuality resulting in the woman containing as many men as the man, and the man as many women, as all capable of entering, men with women, women with men, into relations of production of desire that overturn the statistical nature of the sexes. Making love is not just becoming as one or even two, but becoming as 100,000. So anyway, for whatever that is. Desiring machines are the non-human sex, not one or even two sexes, but n sexes. Schizoidanalysis is the variable analysis of the n sexes in a subject beyond the anthropomorphic representation that society imposes on the subject and with which it represents its own sexuality. the schizoanalytic slogan of the desiring revolution will be, first of all, to each its own sexes, right? Something like that, which is a play, obviously, on to each, according to their needs, each according to their abilities. So anyway, David, I don't know. I mean, this may be somewhat afield from what you raised in the beginning, but at the same time, I think this is where they're trying to go again to declare, if you will, propose this new desiring, revolutionary, right? In a sense. How do we get to that series outside of the paranoid regressive, right? Or the multiple forms of regressive paranoid machine? And they're trying to replace this delirium, if you will, delirium as an object versus that of the paranoid, activity, right? In a sense, and the simple and the identificatory schemas that are operative. Wow. Yeah. Do you want to say something, David? And then Chris has her.
Sure. What I was going to say is, when I was reading this, I was reminded of Herman Melville's novel Moby Dick, which has a chapter called The Squeeze of the Hand. Yeah. And in it, it's kind of like the men on the Pequod are all squeezing the whale's spermaceti. It's very sexual. And as they do, they all kind of flow into each other in this kind of utopian world that's the reverse of the Ahab world, which is so mechanistic and is going to kill the whale and dissect it and is going to create a kind of hell. Are they saying here, in a kind of squeeze of the hand way, at this point where this happens, this is the crux of where there's a potential revolutionary transcendence, that there are innumerable bodies and fantasies that are all in the state of the finally unblocked flow?
I think that's a great example from Melville, and I think it answers sort of part, or at least begins to give you a path on which you can think through your original question in terms of collective fantasy. For Deleuze and Guattari, the collective fantasy would be this, generous sharing of the hand, this kind of orgasmic, if you will, or collective jouissance, right? That is not really just individual, it is the joining, if you will, in many ways. Yeah. So I think it's a great example. Speaking of which, Deleuze didn't write this about Melville, but he did do a commentary on Melville, by the way. So he had a great affection, for American literature, as you can gather here too, from this. But Melville was one of his favorites. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I think that's a great reading. You should do an essay on that. I think that's a wonderful section of Moby Dick to work with. Deconstructing the phallocratic readings of Moby Dick. I'll give you a few working titles here anyway. That's what I'm for. Yeah. Anyway, but yeah, no, very, very good point. But again, the individual triangulation and remember, most of the people on the ship, right, are not, with family, right? They are not part of triangled, wholly familial relations. Melville is a great artist to think this through in some ways. I think it's a great example. Also, Benito Cereno, in a different way, vis-a-vis colonialism and the colonial desire, who is another, alongside Fanon. I think that's another untapped source, Fanon and Melville, although some people have gone there. Yeah. So yeah, Chris, you wanted to say something? I see you at your mute off. Yeah, Chris, are you there with us or?
Is there okay. Chris?
Yeah, you. Yeah, I see you're unmuted. Yeah. We're going to do the same thing as last week, where if you're unmuted, we're going to put the camera on you. So, right. So.
I did want to say that, Michael, just because you brought up
a
second ago. I was reading Black Skin, White Masks this weekend,
right?
And he uses the word socius in his work too. And so I looked it up, and when you look up Deleuze and socius on the Wikipedia, they don't mention Fanon, but if you go to Fanon and socius on his section, which is a different page altogether, they do say that it was sort of a Fanon attribute, I guess, the socius, that he sort of invented this category, expanding on Freud's ontogeny, and I forget the other.
Yeah.
So I just thought that was interesting.
No, it's interesting. Are you saying in the book? I mean, the Fanon is all the way back in the chapter back in Holy Familialism.
Yeah.
And I think it's page 95, 6, something like that. Yeah, 96.
I just thought it was something I came upon this weekend, and I thought it would be interesting to share. That's all.
Yeah. No, it's great. I mean, it's very interesting. This is the only, they don't relate to Fanon here. It's when Franz Fanon encounters a case of persecution psychosis, so they're looking at the case studies of Fanon, when he was treating, many people from North Africa and people in the Paris metropole. A case of persecution psychosis linked to the death of the mother. He first asked himself to deal with an unconscious guilt complex following on the death of the mother. But he soon learns that the mother was killed by a French soldier. Right? And he goes on here in terms of the decolonization. But you're right. I mean, I can go get, you have the page number on Black Skin, White Masks?
Yeah, hold on.
Yeah. There's also a big debate right now on the French word nègre. Did Fanon also mean it much more than just the way we use black, in terms of, it has a much stronger connotation, in terms of its movement of the skin and what it signifies. And, So Crystal will be well prepared for class tomorrow. We're going to be doing On Violence of Frantz Fanon. So,
Okay, yeah. On page, I have this like funny version with this kind of like graphic.
Yeah, that's the new translation.
But on page 85, he brings up dissociate. So if you want to know.
It's a new translation. What page was it again?
It just, the first time I saw it mentioned was on page 85.
Yeah.
And it just got me thinking about Fanon and Deleuze, and then I just started Wikipedia stuff. So
85? Yeah. Okay. I must have a different edition.
Oh, maybe. Yeah. This is probably a newer one than me.
Well, this is the latest. This is the new translation that created quite the story, which is Phil Cox, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, yeah. Anyway, this is the section on the Senegalese.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. It wasn't like making a big point. It was just
okay. The word. Yeah. No. I mean, they're very well aware of Fanon.
Yeah. No, I know.
And obviously, Fanon's work is one impetus for the whole section on the savage and the barbarian, right? Or the wild and the barbarian and that transition, and how that builds. And yeah.
So
anyway,
is it in chapter 4, Josh?
Yeah, 4.
Okay, I had this edition. So 86, you said? Page 86.
85.
85.
Yeah, but the socius is invented by Pierre Naville, right? Right? It's Pierre Naville, the surrealist writer, who invented the term socius.
Okay.
Yeah.
And by the way, Michael, since you mentioned the concept of negre rather than black, but Critique of Black Reason, also the French title is Critique de la raison nègre.
Right.
Yeah.
Critique of Black Reason, yes. Right.
Yeah.
There's also the use of the word, which evokes certain things in the French language that it doesn't in our language. Right. Yeah. So interesting, right? So in this regard. So anyway, I want to go back to this section. Some other thoughts about this. Again, it's an attempt to really again.
No, if I may, I mean, there are so many important things in the long section you read, but one thing that I particularly like, so I just call attention to that, right, is toward the end of page 295, speaking about the molecular unconscious, right? When they say it knows nothing of castration because partial objects lack nothing. And I find this, a wonderful and precise description of a singularity. We spoke at times about that, but so we may want to make some comments on this. I mean, because each partial object is what it is, thisness, right? So, I mean, it's a wonderful moment, actually.
Which never can be fully totalized. That's the beauty of their notion of the part object here.
Right. And then there is the molecular composition and the explosion of all this. Yes.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, Carl. Yep.
Oh, well,
yeah, and if you got to raise your hand, Matt, thank you for doing that. Matt.
One thing is I hope at some point, maybe not tonight, but at some point we can touch a little upon the prior chapter and their discussion of the socialists in relationship to how they think about capitalism. But I think I'm going to be sort of maybe the voice of skepticism about what they're doing here, because I actually think it's problematic to kind of put it mildly. I mean, I think that, the way I read it is that, the passage you read, Michael, that the basis of it seems to me to be back on 287, 288, and 289. And they're actually talking about molecular biology, and they're referencing work in molecular biology. And they're, I think, trying to get away from this idea of sort of this, this organized structuration of the unconscious by talking about allosteric proteins and selection mechanisms and chemical affinities. And I don't, I'm not a molecular biologist, but they talk about these, that they're not bound by certain chemical affinities, so that the selection process is in some sense open and random and generative.
This is the reading of the book by Jacques Monod, Chance and Necessity.
Right. And then they go on to talk, and this references a prior site. This kind of goes back to, this theme has come up before when they're talking about the chains. And they talk about, aleatory phenomena of chance, and Markov chains, which are Markov chains, are certain random generating process.
Right.
So they're talking about and then they kind of counterpose that to the statistical aggregate and the law of large numbers. And I found this passage just very, very problematic.
In what respect, though? Where do you see the problem?
In almost every respect.
Yeah.
It's
okay.
In the sense that they're trying to sort of counterpose this other idea of the unconscious, the molecular unconscious, to sort of the Freudian constructions, and I think the Lacanian constructions that are based on lack, that are based on global objects, that are based on prohibitions, that are based on symbolic orders, etc. So they're almost like dissolving it back. It's like this biological reductivity, where they're sort of trying to say that, the unconscious sort of exists and is constituted at this molecular level. And they actually use the word that it is, at man's basic stratum, the id, the schizophrenic cell, the schizo molecules are chains and jargons. There is a whole biology of schizophrenia. Molecular biology is itself schizophrenic. So they're actually trying to sort of refer, and I don't read this metaphorically or poetically. I think they're actually saying that, I think particularly Guattari is trying to say that there is an actual molecular basis. They're trying to return to the body and kind of reworking Reichian themes. So I find that problematic on, I think, multiple levels, the reductivity and later the lack of any kind of symbolic mediation. I don't think you can explain psychological processes. I'm philosophically an anti-reductivist. Mm-hmm. I think that the operating principles that govern chemical affinities and the selection of genes are very different, and Markov processes are very, very different than, I don't want to sort of go, but I think if you really deconstruct these two pages, there are a lot of real problems in it. then they refer to like the social is now being subsumed under the notion of the statistical aggregate and the law of large numbers. They misunderstand, as I can tell, the law of large numbers, and subsuming all of a sudden the social in a statistical aggregate goes completely counter to their entire prior argument. Because I think you could raise other problems, but I think that
there's a storm happening. Just give me 1 second.
Yeah.
A storm happening outside. Papers around? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Please go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, but what do you see here? The project collapse is on the way from psychoanalysis.
Yeah, I mean, I think
analysis. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, I mean,
but what is the basis for that? A misreading of biology? Because I'm sure they have many levels in here too that are going on as well. I mean, they're defining their terms. They redefine libido in this context. They're using the language. They have many things in terms of microphysics as well. So they're reading a very French tradition here, Jacques Monod and other people like this. So I don't,
well, but to argue that you just either have to throw out pretty much at this point all of Marx and, as I can tell, all of Freud and all of Lacan, just sort of throw it overboard and say that the underlying generative process of the unconscious
they're not Chomsky, and they're not really dealing with that kind of thing. They're working on a plane of immanence all the way. They're not trying to look for new generative. They're looking at immanent phenomena. Yeah.
But they're referencing,
if I may,
the molecular unconscious. They're actually referencing biological processes and Markov chains and aleatory processes.
Yeah, I mean, they use that as an example. Yeah.
Bruno, go ahead.
I think that precisely the plane of immanence that Michael mentioned, I was about to go to that as well, because I believe that the main structure framework of the discourse, the tracing, is ontological. More than any other thing. And so the plane of immanence in that sense is, and whether they speak about the molar and the molecular, that opposition, or because you and I were Zooming last Monday, we spoke about the socials and the body without organs, and I want to call attention to, remember, there is a passage on page 281 where we can go, in which they say very clearly the socius is the clothed body, and that they imply, including the socius, everything, including and the body without organs is the naked body. Page 281, right? We can read. This is 10 lines from the end of the middle paragraph. The socius is not a protection of the body without organs, a projection. Rather, the body without organs is the limit of the socius, right? It's tangent of a deterritorialization, the ultimate residue of a deterritorialized socius. The socius, and then they say, the earth, the body of the despot, even capital, money, are clothed full bodies, just as the body without organs is a naked full body, but the latter exists at the limit, at the end, not at the origin, and doubtless the body without organs haunts all form of a socius. So, the structure that I see here is ontological, typically, but not in the tradition of ontology. Ontologically, and it's interesting that they say it is at the end, not at the origin, so it is not a ground of anything, not ontology in that sense. So it's not simply, right, the twofold typical structure of perhaps even ontology. It is inclusive because precisely they say comes at the end and it is the limit, a moment, a long, of course, moment, a process of constant individuation, right? That also includes what we saw later, that, the partial moments, the partial objects right? Making up everything. So it is the constitution of the world, the constitution of history, the constitution of everything. That's what ontology, and as Michael, you said, it is the plane of immanence, right? That for Deleuze especially is so important, right? So I think that this gives really, that this allows us to understand, right, what they're doing, because it is, again, it's not a treatise that wants to explain everything, but it is an exploration into ontology, right, and the constitution of everything, I believe, of the real.
And again, the idea is the end. It's closing the limit, right? I mean, with all due respect to David Harvey and all the kind of attempts in political economy or even anthropological readings of Marx, they see the limit, the absolute limit of capital as schizophrenia. This is what they're going to. The paranoid machine and the regression and the Oedipal triangulation, the daddy, mommy, me, and all of these forms and the neurotic on the couch can be recaptured by the capitalist machine. This is essentially, I mean, to go back to the word ontology, one of the most anti-capitalist ontologies ever written, in my view. I mean, in a sense, they're relentless in their attack upon that. Anything that smacks of being able to be re-territorialized, back into the system, they're going to go after. I mean, they might not be experts on molecular biology or Markov chains and whatever, or microphysics, but I think they're using this language to get to something. That's all. I don't think they're really claiming to have a truth. I think they're trying to come to a limit and really read a massive symptom where they want to go from there and say, look, desire ultimately will always be paranoid, reformist, regressive, etc., unless we break through where we are today. And if our political world doesn't demonstrate over the last 40 years at least, or 50 years since this book was written, that I mean, to me, there's a lot of evidence out there that they're absolutely right. We're talking about pre-New Deal, America's back policies in this country right now. And on the other hand, we have a new forms of fascist desire reconstituting themselves around Trump, Bolsonaro, Modi, Duarte, etc. So if you look across the globe, this global field, or if you look at this as global cinema and its coextensiveness with where all these phenomena is taking place, I think this book gives us a tremendous amount of insight into how do we break the walls. I'm not saying that they have the answer or that they're trying to ground this completely in, the biological. I think Bruno's right. The ontology is before the biological there. The biological is another level that they're using, as is the psychoanalytic. They're not, again, like I said, there's a compensation going on here, and the Marxism as well. I mean, they're not criticizing Marx. Yeah, in a sense, they're picking up on things. I've never seen a reader, and I have to find the passage because I want to see what they're really getting at, who have taken the critique of the Hegelian theory of the state, right? The contribution to the critique of Hegelian state, and talk about this in terms of the division of the sexes and the ontological, the sexual difference. That's my take. So go ahead, Carl. I'm sorry. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, in part, I'm just pressing the case to see where this goes. But let me. I actually want to raise a different reading of this that is less ontological, and it relates to what you were just saying. So if we go back to page 105, they say, hence, the goal of schizoanalysis to analyze the specific nature of the libidinal investments in the economic and political spheres, and thereby to show how, in the subject who desires, desire can be made to desire its own repression, hence the role of the death instinct in the circuit connecting desire to the social sphere. All this happens not in ideology, but well beneath it. There are a couple of other places in the book, where they reference this, but I would like to argue that this isn't fundamentally ontology, although that may be there. but or it could be more than one thing, but that in fact that this is their problem, that they have set themselves a problem, that they want to understand, that, to provide a better answer than Reich provided to this question of how do we come to desire our own subordination. And I believe that what we've read so far there's brilliant aspects of it. It's extremely creative, but I do not think that they have yet found a way to address that question. And the reason why I'm critical of, like the sections on 288, 289, is that they're trying to sort of pose this level that I see as kind of pre-symbolic. It's not ideological. It's not caught up in, myth. It's not caught up in the Lacanian signifying systems, right? They're trying to pose something prior to that, but they have no way of showing that I can see the mediation between that level.
They're not mediated thinkers. They're not Hegelian.
Right, but they have
no levels of mediation here. They're trying to destroy all mediation.
Then let me
get to something new.
I think that they can't show the connection of how that level of desire, the molecular level of desire, gets formed, invested in the social, and how the social mediates and structures that level. There is a transformation, and they are, what I can see, what they try and do is that they evoke this kind of biomolecular level where you have Markov chains, random generating processes that give rise to this open selection mechanism that therefore allows for genetic modification. They're talking about a creativity, an openness, a generativeness, right, that is based on principles of probability. But then they have to refer that to the large social. The social then becomes subsumed in this moment under this category of the statistical aggregate. And I think that's very problematic because it's dissolving the statistical into the social into a statistical aggregate, which I think is a mistake.
I think what I read is that they were trying to do the opposite with the sexes, to take it outside the statistical aggregates. Right, this is what they're fighting against too, right? I mean, they're kind of fighting against that as well, right? I mean, and also, I mean, it's not only the biological, they're also looking at the literary openness. They're looking at the Kerouacs, the Lawrences, the Millers, all of these things too are also happening as well. Yeah, I mean, Carl, you want to tell the notion of the statistical aggregate, how you're using it?
Well, statistical aggregate, I mean, this is, they use this recurrently in these passages. I'm just trying to find the, it's on page 289, I think is where they introduce it. No, wait. This is, okay, 287, where they sort of introduce this idea of, the molecular desiring machine. Stated differently, then they have this. The molecular desiring machines are in themselves the investment of the large molar machines, or of the configurations that the desiring machines form according to the laws of large numbers. So they're making an argument there, that there are these desiring machines that then we find out in the next page are sort of being understood as kind of this unconscious molecular, and that they then form these larger molar machines that then reinvest back in the desiring machines according to the law of large numbers. I just find that a very problematic formulation. I mean, what does that? I mean, the law of large numbers is an argument about a sampling size. It's not. It doesn't seem relevant to reference it there. But then they continue with these themes of statistical aggregates, where you're aggregating many individual observations into a larger, and then you can assume certain things that. So one way of thinking about it is, I just think that they haven't shown how any of these crossings take place. How do we get from the molecular level, which is chemical affinities and genetic selection, to Oedipus? And there's just sort of like, I won't use the word mediating, but there's just sort of like this, they're just sort of introducing this concept as an alternative to a Freudian reading of the unconscious without demonstrating its actual effectivity, as far as I can see.
So I don't think they're denying the unconscious at all. I mean, I think their notion of the unconscious is much more akin metaphorically to the factory than to the theater, number one. And they're looking at this, the unconscious, as a productive sphere, and in the Nietzschean sense, as the unconscious as a positive affirmation constantly. And they're trying to work with that. So there's a positivity in the unconscious that they're always trying to work with, instead of the theatrical, again, the triangulation or the traditional versions of, the way the unconscious plays out, right? So for them, the unconscious is a different, yeah.
Well, let me just raise
sure.
I mean, this I think kind of gets at maybe what I'm saying is that, yes, but I don't think that they would do away with the idea of, like, I think a libidinal cathexis. Whether we think of that cathexis as taking place in terms of partial objects with parents as inductors, or whether we think of that cathexis in terms of global persons constituted by prohibitions, which are these prior themes. But there's still that level where we want to understand subjectivity, and it's very hard.
We have no subjectivity in this book.
Well, but they do talk about subjects. I mean, there are
subjectivity.
Yeah, but if there's no subjectivity, if there's no consciousness, that would be another problem. But what I'm talking about is that we do have experience, and there are these. Freud, whether he's right or wrong, comes up with this very rich framework for trying to interpret the symbols, for instance, that appear in dreams, and so they're not showing how you move between these two levels.
Okay. All right, and I'm gonna have to hold that, because I don't really want to get stuck in this, for the duration. I mean, Bruno, do you want to say something? I mean, because
I want to say
this kind of language. Yeah, go ahead.
No, first of all, back to the passage that Carl read from on page 105, that paragraph. I mean, then in the second half of that paragraph, they distinguish very importantly between reactionary unconscious and revolutionary unconscious. And there they say we define the reactionary unconscious and so on, and they say how they define it, and then the revolutionary unconscious. So without reading now the definitions, right? But what seems to me, what's happening here that maybe addresses somehow, the point that Carl also you raised, I mean, is the question of a direction, the question of and this is taken up again, what they say here by Lord Don in William or Capital, where I think he uses the word vector, it's the vector. And it would be, if not subjectivity, but agency in the sense precisely of Spinoza, the power of acting, right? The power of acting, whereby, because they say precisely that, the reactionary unconscious is the one, whereby there is then that conforms, right? The revolutionary unconscious is, evidently the molecular explosion of so many diseases and so many sexes, and so on and so forth. I mean, so it seems to me that this is important to keep in mind, because of course desire can go in one direction or the other. I mean, servitude is a possibility, as we know very well. The question is, overcoming servitude means that there is a right that we need to change the direction of acting, or thinking and acting.
Read a little further here. Let me just read further where you pointed us to, because we should think in paragraphs instead of 3 or 4 sentences, and I think that's a good rule for radicals to adhere to. He goes on what Bruno was saying, here about we define the reactionary unconscious. This is page 105 in my text. I don't know the other one, but it's in the section on the goal of schizoid analysis that Carl referred us to about 10 minutes ago. Anyway, The revolutionary unconscious investment is such that desire, still in its own mode, cuts across the interest of the dominated. So we have the class interest and the interest at stake here, exploited classes, and causes flows to move that are capable of breaking apart both the segregations and their edible applications. Flows capable of hallucinating history, of reanimating the races in delirium, of setting continents ablaze. No, I am not of your kind. I am the outsider and the deterritorialized. I am of a race inferior for all eternity. I am a beast, a Negro. There again, it is a question. And again, they rely on the poets who break the flows, who are the nomads. And this is important. There's a question of an intense potential for investment and counter-investment in the unconscious. Oedipus disintegrates because its very conditions have disintegrated, its very conditions, its preconditions, etc. Right? The conditions for the possibility of Oedipus are disintegrated. The nomadic, and this is very important too, linguistically too, the nomadic and polyvocal use of the conjunctive synthesis is in opposition to the segregated and bi-univocal use. Delirium has something like two poles, and this is where they're going to go. Where are we in delirium here, right? And it's racist and racial. It's paranoid, segregative, and schizoid nomadic. They're going to try to go to the schizoid nomadic. This has been the goal of that. And between the two, ever so many subtle, uncertain shiftings where the unconscious itself oscillates between, there's intermediation between its reactionary charge and its revolutionary potential. Even Schreber finds himself, Judge Schreber, the paranoiac, right, who's being penetrated by God anally, right, finds himself to be the great Mongol when he breaks through the Aryan segregation. Once the ambiguity in the texts of the great authors, when they develop the theme of races, as rich is ambiguity is destiny, in ambiguity is destiny itself. Here, schizoidanalysis must unravel the thread, for reading the text is never a scholarly exercise in search of what is signified, still less a highly textual exercise in search of a signifier. Rather, it is a productive use, and this is what they're doing throughout this book. You know, whether they're right or wrong, they're trying to do a productive use of the literary machine, the biological advances, the microphysical, everything that they go, linguistics from, the greats of the 20th century, a montage of desiring machines, a schizoid exercise, so that it extracts from the text its revolutionary force. The exclamation, so it's, or the meditation on egotor, on race, is an essential relationship with madness. That's where they're going. I mean, this is a great section that you pointed to.
And if I
so
may,
unless we read the text this way, we lose the reading, in my opinion.
And
but
if I may,
we can say it's an unproductive use and why it doesn't work, that's one thing. But in terms of just taking, saying that they're not scientific, because they're not experts, these are not biologists, these are not, in a sense. I mean, this is the use value of all these things. This is why it's such an immensely interesting work. I mean, most psychoanalysts don't use anything of anthropology, ethnology, etc. They don't use any of this, or ethology, for that matter. None of these disciplines are being used by any of the specialized discourses today. So, in a sense. Go ahead.
No, if I may, just very briefly, but this is still, I believe, in the order of ontology. Now, this is important, the conditions of possibilities, as you were saying. Because, and I want to say, ontology is not just a word that can be, just thrown out there. I mean, it is about the constitution of the world, the constitution of reality. So that process that at one point they say the revolutionary unconscious, right, that can even at one point they say set continents, has the ability to set continents ablaze, the destruction of what is, and the reconstitution of what could be. So this is ontological in the real sense of the word. And so, but that's the point. I mean, can the world, the socius, can reality change? Yes, of course, potentiality is there. Of course, I mean, there is the possibility to not change. So the question is to change the direction, and the direction will be the lines of light, precisely the schizoids. So that's what they somehow, I believe, are proposing, right? Sorry, yeah. I said very brief. Sorry.
So yeah, I mean, I agree with all that, and again, I'm just, and I want to sort of get other people's take on this. But again, I think that we also need to do a critique of their work on its own terms. And in fact, the themes that they reoccur and reoccur and reoccur. I mean, they're working with a certain number of themes and categories and schematics. So, like, for instance, that section you just read, Michael, that, they restate those ideas almost, but even a little more richly on page 276 to 277, where again, they talk about, this kind of, these two images of desire. One is sort of, the fascist paranoiac, and the other is the schizo desire. And again, my question, and I think it's a fair one, I think that, it's fair to ask, like, is this a useful or correct understanding of the social structuration of desire? And, like, for instance, when I read this, it's not clear to me why are there only these two choices? I mean, are there, and how do you get to one or the other? Why does somebody become, like, there's a lot of things that I feel are just sort of, as we move further in the book, just being dropped in because it kind of works to advance the argument without it actually being developed in a sort of more systematic way where you're actually, showing the linkages. So this is, my question to the people who are more informed about psychoanalysis is this a useful or insightful way of thinking about, or maybe rethinking, the unconscious processes in the psyche, right? There's a whole apparatus.
I think there's a beautiful passage of why the psychoanalysis to them isn't really relevant anymore, in which they use Lawrence and they use Miller, etc., and they talk about cosmic phenomena and descriptions of cosmic phenomena that you're never going to get out of the psychoanalytic couch. The blue color of the sky and the blue gray of the atmospheric haze, the blue of the orgone, St. Elmo's fire. They go through this all on 292. Again, there's a very rich metaphorics that happens with the poetics here that is also underlying this as well. This is not a logical treatise. This is what they were criticized for by the right, is that it didn't have the logical treatise to it. This is a work of synthetic activity going on in a highly experimental environment, etc., to try to break through orthodoxies of thinking that go back to the Second International up until the Fourth International, what they saw as a very restricted orthodox psychoanalysis. They take a lot of Lacan here. It's not like they're totally against Lacan's reading of Freud, or Freud for that matter. They're just saying that ultimately it becomes a sin. We have to go beyond it. This is really what they're really trying to do here, constantly. This is what the conjunctive synthesis is really about, and then something else, and then a supplement. Yeah, Josepha, and then Patrick. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'll yeah.
Well, I was just trying to answer Carl, or basically add something. I think, Carl, I don't know if you're trying to find another system to replace the one that he's critiquing, but I think that would be anti-Deleuze. I mean, I think he's trying to go against representation in the sense of the unconscious as the Oedipus structure, or in terms of significant and signified in terms of language, or in terms of, I don't know, but the thing is that he's really against representation. So I think he's trying to find the like Bruno said, a way of being creative, and the only way is by finding a mutation in terms of biology, a new way of thinking, but not a system, because a system would be against his own notion of what he wants to do. That's why he doesn't propose anything, I assume. I haven't got to the last part of chapter 4, but I think that's what it is. So I think if we look for systems, I don't think we're going to find any here, but it's basically the only way that I think you can have freedom from any system, from any socios, let's say. I think it's finding that mutation in terms of biology, finding a new way of thinking, or finding, or in that way changing something. But so I don't know if that helps.
I'll just add to Joseph, I mean, obviously Nietzsche, again, is behind this in a way, who is the most anti-systematic philosopher of modernity. Of the unholy trinity, Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, Nietzsche is the most unsystematic. He's not really building the systematic thinking. I have a disagreement with Deleuze that I think Nietzsche is a dialectical thinker, but that's another course and another story and a long subject matter. But in a way, yes, this is a very Nietzschean moment, particularly with Deleuze's contribution in this book, the anti-system. And to think always as on the one level of what are the conditions for the possibility of something. They're looking at those conditions and what made those conditions happening. And secondly of all, they're trying, again, to always go beyond. It's not so much throwing out something, they're trying to think beyond into another horizon, and whatever they can take, from whatever research is being done, in the 70s. And, remember, they followed up with this book with the 1,000 Plateaus, right? Which is even crazier than this book. This book is logical compared to the 1,000 Plateaus. I mean, at least in the, in the way we think logically. Yeah, please, Patrick. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, and we'll come back.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think Carl raises an interesting point.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole discussion of Markov, and this is part related to what Josepha said. They're trying to develop a logic which has a certain openness to it.
Yeah.
I mean, and this is where I come back to Lacan. Lacan was actually grappling with the same issue in terms of language, but for them, and this goes back to the Gemsleff issue, that it is a kind of materiality in terms of the way in which we understand things. And that's why they're making appeals to this kind of genetic codes in terms of understanding, but a form of coding which is open. It doesn't close itself off. There is always some element that kind of escapes. That's one thing. And this is a basic question that I have, and this is actually for David. Paranoia and schizophrenia. The two are intertwined, at least if you go back to Freud, in terms of understanding the relation between the two. What's going on here? And I don't know if you can clarify this issue, David, at all.
Can you say more when you say what's going on? What?
Well, I mean, in the sense that forms of paranoia, people who are paranoid can be highly functional, and they can operate in the world. People who are schizophrenic, in a sense, become disengaged, at least the clinical variety, not the variety that they're talking about. But there is a certain degree of continuity between the two, and what's the difference?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think this is, to my mind, one of the areas where their book is actually quite confused and sloppy, actually, where I think when they use terms like schizophrenic, it just doesn't really correlate to the modern nosology of that, but also it doesn't really get to where Freud looked at this, where it's, I think even if we go to Freud, which is far, preceding the DSM-5, I think he was really just much more interested not in a diagnosis of saying the person's schizophrenic or not, but as he would put it, that there was always in every neurosis, he writes this in the Neuropsychosis of Defense, a patch against the registration of reality, because that there's something about the registration of reality that creates too much psychic tension, and the psychic apparatus can't really absorb that. So in his way, the paranoid phenomenon is a way of saying there's too much desire in the system. So for Freud, often it occurs that the paranoid is in the service of warding off homoerotic desire by saying, the mind can't imagine that. It can't handle it. It has an impulse that's forbidden or repressed. So the best thing it can do is use a much more primitive defense structure of creating a patch over reality by saying, if I project that through paranoia and assume everyone is after me, or I'm being penetrated by God by a light or something like that, I can find a compromise formation between an out-of-control impulse and a psychic structure that can manage it.
I'd like to add, hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Lydia.
Sorry,
yeah.
the video, I can't get the video and the audio at the same time.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, just to add to that, one of my frustrations with the text is it seems like a lack of disambiguation between schizoid and schizophrenic. Mm-hmm. So schizoid is actually split, and it's the companion to paranoia under Melanie Klein and Freud, I believe. And the sense is that a paranoiac is, it's a condition of anxiety, a la Lacan, in other words, in a ceaseless search for an object that cannot land, and so therefore sees in everything danger, and then splits that off, which is the schizoid position of like a deanimation, a decathexis from life in a state of sort of like catatonia or something like that, is how I think it used to be conceived. And schizophrenia is actually very different. It's closer to paranoia in that it's outward seeking, but it was understood by Freud to be libidinally withdrawn because of his concept that his lack of object reality. In Freud's universe, objects are not that important. And so if someone is experiencing hallucinations, they must be devoid of reality. But the schizophrenic actually has, in contemporary neuroscience, extra connections. So there's lots of like synesthesia, and that's what creates the condition for psychotic, well, not psychotic, but I want to say active hallucinations. So a sense of active psychosis, hearing voices, seeing sounds and things like that. It's much more hallucinatory. And so it's confusing to me. It seems like that's what they are after, but when they're using paranoia to describe the other condition, it's confusing because that's generally held to be opposed to schizoid, which is very different. So that's a confusion. And then I wanted to also address the question of argument in the text. And my sense of reading is that this is a series of very close readings that adopt the tone in a mimetic way from the inside of different authorial views. And that by rotating these themes through a whole different set of minds, they're performing a kind of libidinal multiplicity. Right, so they're performing an analysis of the world through different minds, through different eyes, and that's why things don't add up to one thing. They're not going to.
I certainly agree with the latter, and it's a very perceptive remark that they're internal to a lot of authors, and they use a multiplicity of authoritative figures, particularly in the French domain. Yes, and I think that's very well put, and that's that engagement that they keep performing throughout this and multiplying as it goes on. I just want to mention another thing here too So, you know, aside from the clinical language or wherever we are with the clinical language, again, the attack here is on what they consider, and they may be wrong, and I'm certainly open to hearing this, but one thing they want to go after is castration and lack. They see this as a limitation constantly, which seems to them to be the bedrock, the strata, the geological bedrock on which psychoanalysis is built, where the anxiety is, which produces, the paranoid, the schizoid, the neurotic, et cetera, and all of us in our certain unhealthiness. And why is it this castration anxiety, this fear that doesn't allow us to destroy institutions which have totally failed, or to take on power at certain levels, or live to our, to our empowered selves. So this is something that I think that is very much a stake for them throughout this book, that they're really trying to get beyond lack. They're trying to get beyond, again, this bedrock on which they consider psychoanalysis to be built upon. And going back to Lacan and mathematics, Lacan wanted to mathematically formalize the unconscious. This was most of his work from 72 to 1980. There's a whole school that came out of him, including Alain Badiou in a different way, the philosopher Alain Badiou. So this is another interesting moment of this drive to have systems and this drive to have this. For Nietzsche, this was a misdirected energy to build systems that have the ultimate truth or the truth to them. Yes, Carl. Yeah, please.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm actually really glad you raised that. I mean, because I think that even though we're all raising, I think some of us who are maybe a little more critical of this book, I think, I think David's term sloppy, that actually occurred to me at times reading it, that it's very creative, it's very generic. I'm not saying I don't, it's a fascinating book, but there is like something a little sloppy. But this idea of lack, the way I read them is that they don't like this idea, but they don't actually, from what I see, sort of engage in an eminent critique of why that is a misrepresentation of how we should understand desire, right? They sort of kind of recurrently say, psychoanalysis, it just under the rule of the signifier, and Lacan tried to escape this, but he just reinforces it with the castration, and the master signifier redistributes lack to the, there's these, which is all very interesting. But again, my question would just be, as from an amateur point of view in terms of psychoanalysis, is this a correct? I mean, in the sense that it seems to me desire or need implies lack. Mm-hmm. I mean, it just like on that basic level, if I'm hungry, I lack food. And if I don't get food, eventually I will die. So, like there's certain very basic things. Now you could say with sex, maybe it's not quite so simple, right?
So Carl, let me just interpret castration for you as Oedipus. So the problem with castration, master signifier, and everything is patriarchy, basically, that there are these traditions that seem embedded in a kind of singular figure of domination represented by a phallus, blah, blah, blah. But that is exactly what castration is, and therefore a theory of lack as castration is not going to do it. Paranoia, schizoid, and schizophrenic are all pre-Oedipal states, and therefore they are not subject to the laws of castration. They need to be understood differently, libidinally, or purely of the bodily functions a la Freud.
I'm not sure I totally understand that. There's
no entry into the symbolic order or into the law itself until there's castration, that anxiety. The father's no, the patriarchal no, is the entry into the symbolic order. No, you cannot do this. This door is closed. That's Oedipus as signifier, Oedipus as imperialism in this kind. And and what Lydia is pointing out too is that this is a phallocratic, a phallocentrism that they are trying to take apart in a certain way, in their way. And they see this as the result of and again, the movement from the barbarian despotic machine to civilized machines, right? Right? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, Josefa, please tell us, and then I'll go to Bruno. Yeah, how the capitalist system structures this. Yeah.
I think it's in. I mean, the sections there that you know, the capitalist machine basically structures the socios into form of, you know, lack whatever consumptions. So I think that's obvious. So you need whatever, you need a house or something, and so it's the lack that you know, that you respond to. So your desire is, let's say, formatted in that way of lack, I think.
Bruno? Yeah.
Oh yeah, in a sense I'm following on that, and then of course the important point raised by Carl, the question of desire and lack. But then I was wondering whether desire itself is, you know, desire is not lack, it's the object that is lacking, right? But that's different from placing lack at the basis of everything. Desire is a potency, so it's not, right? So it seems to me that it is different from what is lack, right? Whereby one then desires something. The something is, so and the object can change, of course, but the structural desire is, if I may, again, ontological, you know, I mean, it's there anyway, you know, it's there to begin with, and it is the same as being alive, being active. And this is not only, of course, I mean, one can even go to Hobbes, right? I mean, the desiring machine is already found in Hobbes. I mean, being without desire is like being dead, right? So maybe we can think about this question of lack not as equal, of course, to desire, but you know, the question of, if anything, the objects.
Yeah, and the working predicate throughout this section, this introduction, and we haven't gotten to positive tasks. And again, I mean, I'm certainly open, and I'm sure they're open to critique too, in a way. You know, they're not, you know, these are not, you know, quote, hostile that they're in possession of the truth or the complete way out. But in a way, the predicate here is really that somehow to them, to their way of thinking, and you're also dealing with a clinician at a very high-powered, open-ended psychiatric institution comparable to Meninger's Clinic or McLean Hospital, Austin Riggs, you know, in France, that had many, many experiments during the 50s and the 60s, open collective fantasy, many, many experimental things, very different than the quote-unquote psychiatric institutions of today that have people highly medicated and nobody can afford 2 or 3 years to stay in and get their head right through intensive psychoanalysis or, you know, et cetera, or psychodrama therapy or whatever. So anyway, they're thinking this through in terms of that what they see in psychoanalysis is the inability, if you will, right? Or their psychoanalysis' own lack to understand delirium. And where do they go to delirium? They go to the mad. They go to Antonin Artaud, the theater of cruelty. I got no pop-up daddy mummy, right? Etc. They go to Arthur Rimbaud, right? The great poet, right? Who basically leaves France and goes to North Africa, right? And writes poetry that is nothing but flows. I mean, Tony and Bruno can speak to this. Rimbaud is you know, I think, you know, I wrote a paper when I said, you know, his metaphysical vision was so great, it drove him crazy. He went mad because of his metaphysical, no man could handle that kind of vision, what he had in terms of breaking the flows. Nietzsche, Hölderlin, Henry Miller, D.H. Lawrence, all of these people, the movies of, you know, Nicholas Ray, Godard, you know, the first quote unquote cinema as thinking machine. And also at the same time, I think also the point here again is to listen again, like Freud said, and Freud said this, and I think he was very honest with himself when he said, before the poets, we lay down our arms. Yeah, we lay down our arms because they're coming to terms and they're sensing something beyond. So they're trying to listen to a different group of people, no longer to listen to Goethe, no longer to listen to, I mean, they listen, but they want to listen differently now to that, against the state machine. Because for them, this Urstaat that I emphasize is very important in terms of psychic and social repression, and something that's not understood by any of us. This is why they go there. Yes, David, please. Yeah.
Right. What I was thinking, and this is where I just feel like I'm just kind of not getting them, and I really just feel like, oh God, these guys are frustrating me because it seems so interesting, but I don't.
I understand.
Talking about is, and the part we were reading about Marx on 294.
Yep.
It's that part where he says, but Marx says something even more mysterious. That the true difference is not the difference between the two sexes, but the difference between the human sex and the non-human sex.
Right.
It's clearly not a question of animals or of animal sexuality. And then a little later, they define the non-human as the desiring machines are the non-human sex, the molecular machinic elements, their arrangements and their syntheses, without which there would be neither a human sex specifically determined in the large aggregates, nor a human sexuality capable of investing these aggregates. So, help, but I just feel...
Yeah. Well, the machine for Deleuze is the notion of, the maximum extension to flows, right? This is what the machine really does, right? It's anything that interrupts flows, too, right? This is the defining thing when they use the word machine. Right, when this is being used. So they're technological machines, non-human, they're sexual machines, they're social machines, they're desiring machines. All of this, again, goes back to this. And those of you that read, remember that they're also going back to nowhere or everywhere, or what I like to call, where to, the Samuel Butler great thing on the beginning of artificial intelligence. They're also talking about intelligent machines here too. They're anticipating a lot of AI too,
but,
in a sense. Right? Yeah, please go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Right. Would it be a distortion of what they're saying to say a film like Sallow is kind of the non-human desiring machine sex because both the victims and the libertines don't really have libido in the conventional sense? They're not kind of human sex. They're not filled up with libido understood as a kind of connectedness or a tenderness. There's a total deadness in that film that feels inhuman, of saying even the victims, Pasolini deliberately makes them so you don't really feel sorry for them. You're, as a viewer, just kind of removed, saying, I'm watching kind of non-human people in this infernal villa doing something dead.
David, I don't think that's what they're getting at.
Okay.
I think they're getting at basically the will. So I think this has to do with all the German philosophy that led up to Freud's theory of drive. And so you've got Spinoza and you've got Schopenhauer and you've got all these theories of what is inhuman in the human that makes the human do these human things. It's really something inhuman, right? Something of all of nature or of life itself.
Right. No, I agree, but I think that's correct. And this kind of, I think, gets back to the point I was raising earlier. And David, I would say, it may be that the frustration is that maybe what they're saying doesn't really make sense. I think we need to hold that option open here. And again, what I see them doing in this the section you reference is, the problem is sort of the logic of composition, right? Like, how do you go from the molecular level, right, with, chemical affinities and selection processes to more complex phenomenon, such as how we experience desire or need. And I think that's, so they're trying to reference this non-human level, right, which is sort of pre-symbolic. It's prior to language in some sense. That's how I see them. But the problem that I see always...
Put it in revolutionary language and Leninist language, they may be looking for the little screw always in the machine, right? He used that metaphor often. the little screw in the machine that, you know, is going to tilt it a certain way. You know, they bring up George Jackson and John Brown in the same breath in this moment. Now, what is John Brown's desire? To become black? Is that what it is? I mean, really, in a sense, where does this come from? Right, in a sense, if it's not daddy, mommy, me, it's not that. It's much greater than that. You know, where is Rimbaud's desire to go to North Africa after a career of poetry and, you know, basically run guns in North Africa as being, you know, one of Europe's greatest symbolic poets? You know, I mean, I think they're looking at, you know, something very different than we're accustomed to in our quote, bourgeois lives in a certain way. They're trying to kind of upend, right, all these, you know, kind of ways we recode so easily into what we know, right? Because this is not a book of knowledge. This, again, like I said, is, you know, at the beginning and to emphasize again, is the book of the flows. And if we read it that way, I think we begin to see it in terms of something else, you know, than just being, you know, logically connected, etc. I understand the frustration. I'm very frustrated too. There's a massive stuff in here. I have a huge library, and I have some of these books I don't have. And I've read almost, you know, most of anthropology, as much as psychoanalysis as a philosopher has time to do, and, you know, most of the work. But you know, they're citing people way out, right, and the literature, etc. So it is this agglomeration, if you will, that is this kind of, you know, throwing everything together, but it is in the name of something, to me, that seems to be a very noble project, right? In the sense that they want to get beyond, right, what happens to the desiring production, right, the desiring machine in these times of, you know, crisis, if you will, or in the time of you know, very deep, you know, problems, disasters, etc., that actually tilts the direction towards the fascist or the servitude or the servile intensities, if you will, rather than towards the liberatory. And they're trying to understand this. I mean, this is why I think they're going all over the place, from biology to ethnology to, you know, et cetera. They're trying to understand what makes this servitude, this servility, you know, possible, you know, so many times. We witness it all the time, you know. I mean, you know, I have friends, highly educated friends, who act like Joe Biden's the best thing in the world, right, at this point, because of the new plan, the new New Deal, or whatever this is called, which is nonsense. This is 100 years ago where we're dealing with things like this. Still haven't encountered this. So we haven't moved at all. There's no notion of progress here, in a sense, you know. Yeah.
No, I like their project. It's not the intent, but, you know, just to go back to what David was saying. So, I mean, this is, again, how I'm reading it.
Okay.
And so, like, you know, that paragraph, David, is, you know, the desiring machines are the non-human sex, the molecular machinic elements, their arrangements and their syntheses. So that's where they, you know, it goes back to the other section where they're talking about Markov chains, aleatory processes. Then if we go back a little bit further into finally where they, in the prior chapter, they talk about, you know, the emergence of Oedipus. And I think what they're doing here, I like a lot, and I'm very sympathetic to, is that they're trying to say there's something prior to the private person, that there's, so they're saying they private persons are therefore images of the second order, images of images, that is, simulacra, that are thus endowed with an aptitude for representing the first order images of social persons. So I, you know, this is back on page 264. And, you know, then there's, you know, a long paragraph. I know it's better to read the whole paragraph, but the, you know, then they talk about father, mother, and child thus become the simulacrum of the images of capital, Mr. Capital, Madam Earth, and child the worker. And again, you know, I'm very sympathetic to, like, both operating at both these levels. The problem I see is, how do you construct the relationship between the two? Because you know, they want to talk about how this molecular level is repressed by the social in some sense, that the repression, the social repression, is operating on desiring production. And so desiring production is being located and explained at this molecular level. That's where they ultimately go to when they want to kind of ground this concept. And again, I think that I don't think that they're successful in terms of achieving their own ambitions internal to the book. Right? That's I think, you know, again, the problem I see, the limit, the way they formulated this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, you know, really know how to, you know, defend it, except on the level, again, that it is an experiment with different kinds of, you know, syntheses and involved, and they're trying to found a new discipline and a new type of way of, you know, going through the therapeutic. They're reading both the symptom, and that they think that they found a way to kind of unlock servitude and put desire back on a revolutionary path. You know, they're trying to get to that and strip away how these servilities have been taken place and these intensities. So you have to read it also at the level of intensities, you know, outside of that of, you know, again, you know, whether they're fulfilling the actual terms of their project. I think the project's so immense, and in some ways, yes, it's confused, but they renew that confusion, and that confusion sometimes gives them new process of renewal and overcoming, and does never really become stale. I don't think there's a lot of you know, repetitious staleness here, you know, in some ways. Yeah, Bruno, go ahead.
No, but precisely, but also going back to the title of the seminar, right? Overcoming Servitude, question mark. So the question is, servitude is possible. We know that the exit from servitude is also possible. Now, I was thinking also, because Matt put in the chat, right, conatus in Spinoza as well. But in right, the preface of the theological political treatise, Spinoza says people often fight for their servitude as if they were fighting for their salvation, right? And then at one point in the Ethics, he also explains, in a sense, what this is, that very often, even when we see the better course, we take the worse, right? I mean, so going against our own advantage, and the explanation there, if you will, is the passions, right? And so, but that's the desire is always there, the passions, and of course Spinoza is not saying we should get rid of the passions altogether. So it is the liberatory moment that, in a sense, we find here as well. I mean, because of course there is much of Nietzsche, Spinoza, and so many other things. But the question of liberation, right? I mean, what can explode the moment of capture that then we will see then in 1000 Plateau, evidently, but you know, whereby servitude can be you know, eliminated, right? So that's the question. So I think that it is the non-systematic way of going in this, right? The way in which they write the book is part and parcel of the projects of the project of liberation, in a sense, right? Because you cannot probably do so by writing, you know, once again, another system creating, and yeah, because again, ontology, as I said, the constitutional, but we can say this point maybe the constitution of reality, right? That's so there is this movement away from, on the basis of the distraction of the reactionary and old, the movement towards something revolutionary and new, right? I don't know if that makes sense, but I see that.
Again, the tendency in France was always, and again, we have a hard time with this in North America in some ways, you know, our backgrounds, et cetera, et cetera. But the tendency in France is to really look at the notion of phenomenological destruction and critique as scaffolding, right? You're relentless about it. You know, you want to create, and again, a new language. This is the Althusserian insight about Marx. He is just not critiquing Adam Smith or David Ricardo. He is creating an entirely different language. He has shifted terrain. So Deleuze and Guattari, stylistically and in terms of their makeup and the French educational system at that point, are really in that moment of saying, you know, we're trying to shift the terrain of thinking, right, in a sense. You know, we've been Oedipalized to death. We've been orthodox Marxized to death, right, in a sense. We want to kind of create a new terrain of language. And the thing is, the analysis, again, the schizoid, both the break and the absolute limit that they say. They define terms. I mean, in a way, they're very careful, despite the quote sloppiness, right? They're very careful. They'll define the terms of that the schizophrenic is the absolute limit of capital. You know, not the relative limit, but the absolute limit. So again, to go back to this notion of a telos, they're trying to think this through that. And then the schizoid analysis is those breaks, those little ruptures, those little glimmers of light towards the future on a different terrain and a different notion. So there's not a continuity here. This is ruptures and discontinuities throughout, I think. I mean, you know, to me, this is really what they're doing. And I mean, I don't know enough about Markov chains to judge whether they use this appropriately or the literature. I mean, I've read, you know, Monod and other people, and certainly, you know, Darwin and other biologists. And, you know, I know some of the debates in France, but in a way, but all to say, I mean, again, they're trying to use these thinkers, right? And as was well put out there, as Lydia said, this kind of multiplicity of thought and thinking and working through things, you know, in this collective way. And as they said, we're not just collaborating here. We're just not building a treatise. We're multiple streams that keep coming up against riverbanks. So if we read it that way, I think, again, listen, I'm sorry to, you know, I know I'm repeating myself, but the idea here is to read this as a work, if you will, of poetic ontology in some ways. You know, I think this is a richer way of approaching it, you know, that the poetic ontology here is just as important as, quote, the argumentative rigor, if not more so, you know, in a way. Are we able to free up the mental servility that we have to these past structures? You know, are we able to free up the servility of action? Are we able to create, you know, conditions for new agency and thought as agency, as well as agency as thought? This to me seems to be the task before us, even for today. One of the reasons you read a book like this, again, and by the way, you know, this book is being used, you know, we're way ahead of the game, but we have to write it up. But anyway, it's being used alongside Mass Psychology of Fascism and trying to understand the present moment in a group with Red May, which is the West Coast Left Forum, so to speak. You know, with Robin Morosco from Hunter and Warren Montag, who's an Althuserian on the West Coast, and other people, Assad Haider. You know, they're trying to go back to this too and see the relevance of it for today. You know, how can we, what is its, you know, for lack of a better term, to use the old language, what is its use value or what is its pragmatics at this point? So again, I just want to reiterate that. I'm not trying to, you know, I mean, I like the criticism. It's very helpful. I think it stimulates and pushes us on the way. But if we lose the force of the poetic ontology here, you know, the reading is then, you know, we're doing exactly what they don't want us to do, right? In a sense, right? You're like the neurotic on the couch, sitting back in the easy chair, reading it, right? In a sense, instead of, you know, saying, I'm going for a walk here with this stuff, man. I got some bombs to throw, you know, anyway, I'm just playing, but yeah.
No, I sometimes, you know, that the way I think about it is it's a book that's both of social theory and sometimes I think of it as a work of science fiction.
Yeah.
You know, it's like at that level of.
Well, it looks like science fiction is the most advanced thinking of our time right now.
Yeah.
Given what's going on, right? In a certain way. Yeah. I mean, you know, I don't think they had, they may have used Ballard and others and Gibson in the I don't remember if they used them there, but you know that again, neuroromancer and these kind of things are very much in tune with our time. You know, by the way, I think Fred Jameson's best book of the last 30 years is the book The Archaeology of Science Fiction. It's archaeologies of the future. So really a remarkably good book about science fiction. Yeah, David, please, and then I'll go to Bruno.
Oh,
yeah.
Thank you, Michael. But in this little part there on Marx, they're very specific where they say molecular elements that constitute these aggregates under determinate conditions. The dwarfism of desire as a correlate to its gigantism. I wonder if you could say more in the poetic ontology, like, while this is all very molecular for a moment, is it partly their goal to say the aggregates ultimately are understood more broadly as aggregates of psychosocial elements of people like the proletariat mixing with the oligarchs ultimately in humanity, where there would be the squeeze of the hand utopia of erotic flow between groups that are held apart? I mean, is it partly a way of moving from a molecular aggregate to, you know, individuals in a particular set of determinate conditions? And when they say determinate conditions, do they mean determinate intrapsychic conditions, or for them is it really always more the social force of capitalism is creating this?
I think when they use the language of determinate conditions, they're replicating Marx's vocabulary there more than, more than Freud. Yeah, I think so. And that has to do with the socius and its determinate conditions, right? I don't think this is a speculation on utopia. I don't see them holding hands ultimately.
Okay.
Too much of antagonism here in terms of the class relations, et cetera, right? Yeah.
I think they also say on the top of 280.
Right.
They say, doubtless it would be a mistake to contrast these two dimensions, there's the molecular and the, these two dimensions in terms of the collective and
the individual. Yes, right.
You know, so I think they're making that point to sort of separate that out.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is interesting too. I mean, again, there's a meta level always going on here too, where they're reading multiple Freuds, the clinical Freud, the metapsychological Freud, the neurological Freud is all going on, as well as the humanist Marx, as well as the, later Marx of Capital, et cetera, et cetera. So Freud was Darwinian, neo-Darwinian, when he said in the unconscious, everything was a problem of population. Likewise, in the contemplation of multiplicities, he saw a sign of psychosis. It is therefore more a matter of the difference between two kinds of collections or population, the large aggregates and the micro multiplicities. In both cases, the investment is collective. Maybe to go back to your whole thing that you began with tonight, David, this kind of maybe comes back around. The investment is an investment of a collective field, even as a lone particle, but it has an associated wave as a flow that defines the coexisting space of its presences. Now we're going to get into quantum mechanics, but anyway, they're into wave particles now. But anyway, every investment is collective, the coexisting space of its presences. Every investment is collective. Every fantasy is a group fantasy, and in this sense, a position of reality. Right? But the two kinds of investments are radically different. According as the one bears upon the molar structures that subordinate the molecules, and the other, on the contrary, bears upon the molecular multiplicities that subordinate the structured crowd phenomena. One is a subjugated group investment, right? And as much as in the sovereign form as has its colonial formations of the gregarious aggregate, which socially and psychically represses the desire persons. The other, a subject group investment in the transverse multiplicities that convert desire to a molecular phenomena. That is, as partial objects and flows as opposed to aggregates and persons. So I think this is a very, again, a good point that Josh brought up this little section here too about the separation and the over, if you will, writing again of the language of individual and collective, or collective and individual, and how this plays out for them. I mean, very, very interesting. And, the whole thing of, on the unconscious, they're reading Freud's text on the unconscious here. And I think rightfully bringing it back to a kind of neo-Darwinianism, in terms of the populations. Some analysts say the peopled, unconscious, your unconscious is peopled by. So you can see what they're trying to do. Yeah, Bruno, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, no, just a short point, but maybe we read this some weeks ago, but the very end of part 2, in a section called the process, right? When they early on defined the skids, as against the signifier, they say that's the skids and not the signifier. And they say it's basically many local fires, that's page 137, patiently kindle for a generalized explosion.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's quite a project. I mean, it's not that, so that there is a real, clear.
What is the name of the book that Henri Lefebvre wrote in 1968?
Passage that you were reading.
It's under after you get through the reading of the Petty reproduces. Again, I mean, they're using poetics here. I'm kind of surprised, very funny on page 279. Oh, mother, farewell with a long black shoe. Farewell with Communist Party and a broken stocking. With Hitler, years of starving India. With your eyes of Czechoslovakia attacked by robots. Your eyes being led away by policemen to an ambulance, with your eyes with a pancreas removed, with your eyes of appendix operation, eyes of abortion, your eyes of ovaries removed, your eyes of shock, lobotomy, and divorce. And anyway, basically, paranoia and schizophrenia, which like are talking girls' first names. Why do social investments follow this dividing line that gives them a specifically delirious content, recreating history in delirium, right? And this is what they're going, and they go through Canetti, who I think we have something to learn from too. I don't know how you feel about Canetti, Bruno, but again, Crowds and Power is an interesting book in terms of mass psychology, I mean, look, I'm very fond of Gustave Le Bon, The Crowd. You can gain from him. Freud's group psychology, or if you're with Masson psychology and the I self, mass psychology of fascism, Canetti's Crowds and Power, and of course, this book in terms of how do we understand this desire that fuses with the most atrocious elements in society and ultimately invests consistently in this. We live in a world that, Hitler did not die in Germany in 1945. The mentality did not die, right? It goes on. In fact, it got transposed to the United States in a very different form, in many ways, right? What's happened here,
So Michael, to answer your, and I think the way you just put it is, useful. And then, so what would be the answer that you would give to your question based on this work? Like, how do we understand, why do people do this? And what is their answer?
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, I'm in agreement that we have to excavate, everything that we've held sacred up till today, in some ways. Mm-hmm. I'm a firm advocate, revolutionary advocate of that. I'm not saying that we just throw out everything or dispose of everything, but we really have to work through what these institutional practices have done to us, how they have created this mess that we're in, right? It gets worse in all the academic departments. We've had 40 years of nothing of the administered world in academia. There's no thought anymore. There's nothing going on. We really need to begin to this kind of severe critique. Where they're going here, let me just say this. The reason I'm reading this again is when they do this, they're not really just saying, this what Lydia and Jane and David well know that Freud had, incredible insights into the paranoid personality, into schizophrenia, into psychosis, etc. Freud didn't like psychotics. He wouldn't treat them. He wanted neurotics, right? That's where he thought his expertise lay. But what they're really doing here is how the paranoid person, the paranoid and this paranoid investment begins to rule. This is where they're trying to go, right? For them, the schizoid nomadic is somewhat of a flight out. It's a rupture. It's a nomadic break, or the schiz is nomadic, right? So this nomadic tendency that cannot be recoded, if you will, or brought back into the system. I know this is very hard to pull off, but I think what they're really trying to do is take apart everything, right? This is a massive work of deconstruction based on the best of French anthropology, French linguistics, French psychoanalysis, French Marxism, and I'm being very nationalistic, but this is the way the French are. They read each other, right? And they argue with each other, and they go for each other's necks all the time, which has a tendency to produce mighty fine work at times, and other times, very sloppy work, or at least, sometimes. So anyway, the paranoid engenders masses. He is the artist of the large molar aggregates. Again, they're trying to explain, why did the German people themselves desire Hitler?
But where does,
and why do we, in a sense, desire all these reformists, these incremental changes? And why does this investment keep playing out constantly? I'm sorry, yeah, but
yeah, well, no, but I guess, and this is, maybe I'm missing something, but like, where's the explanation? I mean, I'm not, like, that's what seems to be missing. There's assertions, and I wonder.
You don't see this as a very long history of going through the worst aspects, or at least aspects based on their thesis, that we have come to the position of lack in castration. We have come to the position of only reading, capital wage labor relations without an understanding of the state. I mean, this is where they're really kind of going, in a sense, right? That we really don't have a theory ultimately of organization. We don't really have a theory of how the state came together. We don't really, go beyond the traditional, again, couch of the triangulation of the daddy, mommy, me, all of these things. I mean, they're rehearsing this, and they're rehearsing this in terms of the social repression alongside of it, the social, political, socio formations that take place in history, right? Yeah. I mean, instead of reading ancient to feudal society and the transitions into class formations and stuff like this, they're reading libidinal investments, and how this is occurring in history, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and how this libidinal, flow is always playing out in history, and they're trying to explain it through something very different, right? In a sense, right?
Yeah. Again, I want to sort of get to the point where I feel like they're, again, reconstructing the actual explanation. Go back to page 105, and that's where I see. So my one, if I was talking to them, that would be the question I would pose: is that what ultimately, is, where do you come down around this kind of?
Well, they're going to tell you talking like a policeman. That's how they would answer.
Well, yeah, but there's also.
But that's the way they would answer you.
Right, but there's also
how they are.
Also evasion. There's also issues of evasion, and I think that that often occurs in this arena where you don't ever want to be pinned down, because if you get pinned right, you never want to actually say, well, this is really what I mean. because you always want to sort of have.
Well, I think Bruno's book, by the way, which I admire deeply, on Singularities at the Threshold, plural, being plural, if you will, in some ways, speaks to this, because there's always this plural positions. You can't be pinned down. That's the point. That's the point of deconstruction. That's the point of Foucault's light-footed positivism. I slip it out here. We will leave it to our bureaucrats to see that our papers are in order. This is really, in a way, the way of trying to look beyond the Sartrean no exit, to look beyond that of the no exit, that they see that the system can always bring you back in, right? Etc. Right? This is where they're going. They don't really have one position, in a sense. They're trying to build, right, in a sense, this new schizoid analysis. They're trying to read history in a different way. They may be from another planet, but I mean, maybe, in a sense, that planet is seeing something that we're missing. That's all I'm saying. I don't think they have just a one position here. Yeah, in a sense. Yeah, I mean, in a way. That's part of the point of the, yeah.
Then I had a second question, but I think that what I'm talking about is the evaluation of when does explanation occur. So it's explanation, and how do you determine that an explanation is adequate? And that's more what I'm talking about. And I think that they do pose enough. We want to understand certain phenomena that we observe, that they are trying to, I think, pose a framework to enter into that understanding of why these things occur, and then ultimately, how do we move beyond it? I mean, that's sort of how is.
First of all, they have a very original thing. Instead of reading exchange value, as the Marxists do, and use value, they're looking at debt. Mm-hmm. That's one way they look at history, genealogically as debt, through Nietzsche, as opposed to Marx in some ways, right? Yeah. In one way. So they have a different take on this in terms of creditor-debtor economies in many ways, right? So this is another thing in terms of the intensity of the debtor, the schuld, how it leads to guilt, etc., what that formation is, how the guilt then plays out in the family. They'll go through this often in here. So, your father has made you feel guilty. They have many, many levels to all of this. So that's one original move I think they're making outside of, quote, the Marxist tradition, right, in many ways. They also see, and they may be totally wrong about this. I mean, again, I'm not in the clinical field. I don't, see patients or, I mean, I see patients on the street every day. But anyway, on the other hand, they're looking at psychoanalysis. Limit for them is that it cannot deal with delirium, right? It cannot see the poetic delirium that they're citing throughout. From again, and they have their artists. They've chosen their objects, their reference points to deal with. How these people have broken flows, who have opened up lights and exits at certain levels, right? In a sense. And again, they're trying to posit different types of desire, because they're not saying it's just desire as such, right? Only that does the, in a sense. They're looking at how desire becomes reactionary. How does this historical and this accumulation of institutional practices, historical processes, under the sign of capitalism, how has it led to this absolute limit that they say is schizophrenia? How does it lead to this limit, this telos, reading backwards, reading retrospectively from that limit, from the schizophrenic that becomes the highest, quote unquote, symptom, right? Of social and psychic repression in the system. And how do you read from that back into a kind of way out? Because it's not happening with the neurotic who goes back to the nice job on Madison Avenue filled with new creative ideas, analysts who happen to be associated with Edward Bernays. I'm sorry to, in a sense. or puts on a great show for Saturday Night Live. My analyst, gave me these great, yeah, I mean, in a sense, right? I mean, I'm just saying, yeah. So this is what they're trying to be on the lookout for, right? I mean, that's another thing. Again, and the breaking of frontiers, that they love American literature. I don't know if you read that section, but they love American literature for its openness, right? On the road, the Kerouacs, this beautiful thing about Melville earlier today, in a sense, they love this kind of stuff. Right? I mean, this is Deleuze mostly. I don't know about Guattari. He's more in the French ethnology and I'll use psychoanalytic language. His fixations are more on North Africa and South America. He was very good friends, by the way, with the Brazilian president, Lula. Who's coming back, I hope, and against Bolsonaro. But anyway, yeah, David, please. And yeah, I'll go back. Yeah.
Right. One of the other surprising contemporary people who is interested in Deleuze and this, of all people, is the author J.K. Rowling of the Harry Potter phenomenon.
There you go.
But why I was going to bring her in for a second, I have a feeling she may be a little too lowbrow here.
Yeah, it's okay. She's highbrow and rich. Yeah, she's better catch than Bill Gates' ex-wife. Yeah,
she wrapped it up there.
I have friends that joke with me all the time. Mackenzie Smart's available now. Melinda Gates, Michael, you want a revolution? Yeah.
These women can help you finance
whatever. Jeff Bezos is his ex-wife. So yeah, I don't know if Melinda Gates, but please, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah,
but one of her arguable, kinds of brilliance is, in a children's format, the stories have very dark texts that are woven in there that are really very dull. And one of the problems in it is that there are house elves that kind of undergird the labor structure of this very beautiful castle with all sorts of feasts and things going on. And the lead woman in the story is trying to free them. As a teenager, she's horrified by the conditions they're in. And in a really dark way, when she succeeds at that, in most cases, it goes very, very wrong for these elves where they can't function without their servitude. They decompensate, they become alcoholic. It's striking that this isn't a children's book because their stories really go into this extremely disturbingly dark place when the servitude is relinquished.
Right.
Now, for Deleuze and Guattari, do they look at that idea of saying, what would happen if you gave up being enslaved to Donald Trump or whoever, or Bolsonaro, like that at a personal level, this is going to disorganize you because you're too masochistic? I mean, that's what Freud would say. Are they kind of echoing that, or do they see a different problem of the relinquishing of the servitude? That's where I'm not sure I see where their thinking goes. Like, beyond servitude, sort of like...
I don't think it's a relinquishing, I wish it was so simple as just a relinquishment. I think it's much more a working through, and it's a militancy and almost like a guerrilla warfare that's constantly going on. So it's not really just the relinquishing or the letting go of the servitude that's there. I mean, it's an earning of it. For them, the classic examples would be, in some ways, the Jose Dolores of Byrne, or the character in The Last Supper in the Cuban film who puts, the master to sleep and then tells a different story about how the plantation was born. These kind of characters for them are much more important, right? The John Brown is interesting to them, which Du Bois wrote a great book on John Brown, by the way, on the body of John Brown. Yeah, W.E.B. Du Bois. Yeah, so they mentioned John Brown in this chapter, which is, again, a very interesting moment next to George Jackson. Yeah, in a way. Yeah. And they also talk about the images of the unconscious. What comes up to the bourgeois unconscious, right? In a way. Yeah. What is the threat in a certain way? They're also looking at this too as well. So in a way, they're on the side of the elves, but the elves just can't relinquish. They have to, in a way, just say, we're schizoids, and now we have to take agency into our hands. Not that they're clinical schizoids, they're just, they begin to see the breaks and the ruptures, etc. Yeah.
But
Look,
this is
we live. Let me just say this, and then I'll let. Yeah, please, Lydia, in a second. Just 1 second. There's a tendency on the left right now. I'm hearing about this often. That everybody, you know, the militants are going to move to the Marxist-Leninist groups, the disaffected DSA. These are positioning replacements that are very traditional. It has nothing to do with breaks or revolutionary desire in the Deleuzean, Guattarian sense. It lacks understanding, historicity, right? And the ability to, you know, criticize weapons and build weapons of criticism to me. It's just a kind of revolving door of leftism, to my mind, yeah, in a sense. I mean, I'm being somewhat reductive, but I think it's pointed here, they need representation. And what, you know, Bruno and some others were saying earlier about this is a text that is trying to get well beyond representation. And they see that the psychoanalysis gets back to it, even though Freud is expert at taking apart Darstellung in the Dream Book. I mean, it's beautiful the way he does this. So I'm in agreement with, you know, Freud on this, overcomes, you know, the critique here in the Dream Book. You know, this is really the Vorstellung, Darstellung is very much, you know, under attack in the interpretation of dreams. There is no representation ultimately. You know, there are logics, right, but no ultimate representation. Full representation. But anyway, all to say, this to me seems to be the problem on the left in overcoming servitude and why the action. Please, Lydia, I'm sorry to cut you off, but I wanted to get that in. Yeah.
No, thank you for that. Simply, one of the strengths I see is identifying the problem of bourgeois neurosis with the family. In other words, with the loyalties of power structures that are inherited and not questioned, and through which actually supremacy is maintained through practices that could be equated with child abuse. You're withheld love if you don't obey, if you don't actually conform to the societal group expectations manifest by the adults in your household. So there's a sense in which going another way, deterritorializing from that, should allow you to re-territorialize. But I don't see that there's any faith in a solidarity of a group that can perform struggle together. So I don't see a revolutionary brotherhood, sisterhood, or a collection of individuals who are adults who can consensually create. There doesn't seem to be relatedness of that kind, and that is what I'm left floundering with.
Okay, that's a very good point. And why don't we hold that until we get to the schizoid now? That's a very good question, and that's very solid, I think, and very meaningful question. I like that too, because that again is a critique you could level at this book. I think a very honest critique. Where would be the level of collective solidarity as you go forward, right? In a sense, you know, is again the description of the symptoms so much on, but that ultimately when we get to the practice, that it's not going to be the way out, right? So I think that's really well put. Yeah. So Carl, you had your hand up again. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, I was just thinking about what Lydia said. I mean, that's another, you know, I mean, again, I think if you wanted to turn the tables on them a little bit, you could say that it's really just radical bourgeois individualism. That in some sense, you know, it's that there is no collectivity. There is that, you know, that, yeah, I think that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know if I call it liberalism by any means. I mean, you know, that I will argue against. I don't think there's bourgeois liberalism at work here. I think they're left and maybe empty-handed in some ways in terms of collectivity. Or if you really look at it, what movements do we really have? The unions are pretty much defunct, right? In a sense. Yeah. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Is that again, this, what is the practice? So if you say that schizophrenia is the real limit of capitalism,
well, that's a symptom. Yeah.
That go beyond capitalism is almost to enter into this new realm of this new the flows, the space of flows, that in some sense they say, I don't have the page, but that maybe, the problem is not that to go beyond capitalism, we almost have to take its tendencies to the nth limit, to take it beyond itself.
Yeah. There seem to be two economies. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Like, what kind of life is actually being imagined here? What is the nature of the social relationship? What is the nature of the family? What would be, to just say that they're critiquing the family reterritorializes, I mean, yes, at a certain point, but human beings have institutions and collectivities in various ways that we require, both for biological survival, but for some kind of psychological and social integration. And that may be a policing operation, I may be re-territorializing, but if you take a human being and take it out of all those institutions and those networks, you will produce not what we would really recognize as a human being.
But I think they're producing something different. I mean, remember, this became part of an anti-psychiatry movement, right? It also became part of a system of, the orientation here again is an economy of a newfound health. I mean, that's what they're really going towards, a great health. I mean, what I see missing here is what Stiegler will refer to economies of care. I don't really find a lot of care ultimately underneath all this, but I do see an economy of where they're trying to get it to a different kind of health. They see no possibility under the present condition of us living healthy lives, right? In that sense, the possibility of that is not there under the current conditions. And remember, this is 1972, right? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, look, what they're arguing again, to go back to this in terms of the familial, how many parents ever say, when you bring home the bad report card, say, who the fuck are your teachers? Instead, they say, you're not getting your $5 or your $10 and you better study harder. You never really get this kind of dynamic within the family, right? In a sense. And I mean, I'm not repeating what I did, in a sense, but as a professor, I mean, that's the first thing I would say to my kids, I mean, okay, what's going on? Yeah. I mean, our friend Peter Bratsis, his kid goes to school at one of the elite schools on the Upper West Side. And, the teacher's teaching Mao, and she goes to class and she talks about, my father has a statue of Mao at home, and the teacher chews her out for having a father that does things like this. This is the kind of things that we're getting, right, in this relationship, and Peter's a radical. I mean, he's thinking through this. You can imagine what happens, and she gets a B on the paper because she defends Mao, and said the statistics are wrong on how many, people he supposedly killed during the famine and the Great Leap Forward, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, all to say, I think this is, you have to read this with some humor and some, revolutionary levity as well. But at the same time, yes, you're right. I mean, we don't have a concrete proposal, X plan, X to Y to Z, right, to go to at the end. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I mean,
but their movement started at the anti-psychiatry as a liberation of people from the stigmatization, if you will, and also if you how shall I say, against what is mental illness. They threw this into question. Yeah. They threw this into question, completely. And much more than the conservatives like Zaz and others who wrote about the myth of mental illness. This was a very different approach. And, this is also connected to experiments, as I mentioned earlier in the class, to Lang and the divided self and others, going on. And it was a different period. Today you go to I have a friend that went to Bellevue. He had real problems, and he's nearly my age, etc. And all they did was give him drugs. They had no combination, etc. And he was there for 4 or 5 weeks. And then he sees the therapist once a week, and he's assigned a therapist, and there's no connections being made. So, I mean, again, where are we in terms of the the practice towards real health in a sense. And we're treating a culture, I don't know, all the drugs, luckily I've been, not on, any kind of prescribed drugs, at all. But I mean, what are we dealing with? Deleuze and Guattari said, we're treating Valium. That's what they said. We're treating Valium, they said, during the 70s and the early 80s. So now I don't know what they're treating. Adderall, this, that, I don't know all the drugs out. I don't follow this. I know union presidents who are on something because they're so tense and they don't know what's going on. But yeah, so I guess we want to really both contextualize it and then decontextualize this kind of work to make it relevant. First, on the level of, yes, are there codes here? Are there ways that we can rethink our own servitude? We're all servile in differing degrees, with just like neurosis in degrees, we have servile tendencies, etc. I mean, I don't think there's any such thing as a free person. I mean, Sartre, who was probably one of the freest persons of the 20th century, ended up, smoking 2 packs a day, taking Ritalin, and, drinking himself close to death, at the end, because he wanted to complete projects, completely obsessive. Right? And he's the thinker of freedom, right? In one way, Jean-Paul Sartre is the Anti-Oedipus in some ways, right? In some ways, if you want to think about this in terms of group spontaneity and, trying to go beyond everything. Yeah, at one level, that's all. Bruno, please, yeah.
Oh, yeah, no, what I want to say is that, it's not that I agree with everything we are reading here, but what I like, one important thing that I like is the boldness, right? Because we need to think in a bold way. And so if we are serious about the possibility of changing ourselves, the world, everything, and this is a real possibility, things can be different. Then that's why I spoke about, you mentioned my book before, but I said that in the book as well, constitution rather than like the poetic, if you will, ontology of a constitution, right? I mean, to move really to a different plane altogether. So that's what I think they are. I'm not even sure if they are proposing this. And actually, Carl, if I may go back to your point about explanation before that, I was thinking that's interesting. But for example, I myself, I'm not looking for an explanation when I read this book or many other things. This is certainly, I see this more as an exploration.
Right.
And, but if you will, even in phenomenology, for example, already, and that's certainly not in the right tradition of phenomenology, but even there, explanation is no longer what, right, rather description of, right, yeah.
Explanation is for the Jürgen Habermases of the world.
Yeah, because ultimately...
I'm really crazy about it.
Right, because ultimately, why? Because also ultimately it becomes normative. So in the question of the norm, right, and normalization is very central here as well. So that's the point. I mean, to go, beyond to, whatever they call them, the line of flight. I mean, is that a possibility? I mean, in terms of practice, what does that mean? It means that we had to remold ourselves and everything around. And we can do that, first of all, by abandoning the idea that we are what we are, we are individuals. We are not. We are made of many things. I mean, the schizoids are already within us and outside us. And when I say this, I really think this way. I mean, that's my, if you will, the way I relate to.
Let me just give you an example from music. The average music listener listens to the Haitian fight song of Charles Mingus, the original piece, and then the reworking of this, which is part of the music for the new film by Raoul Peck, the 4-part Exterminate the Brutes, right? Right, it's going to be one of the guideposts there. They'll think that Mingus is completely schizophrenic. What is this schizoid music? I had an Italian artist friend. He'd think listening to John Coltrane, it was schizoid to him. So unless you're trained and you have done this, and I had a very good Jamaican anthropologist friend who's, semi-famous today. Anyway, he said, you can't hear Miles Davis if you still have any voices of your family in you. You know, this is the kind of, and I think this is part of what they're trying to do, you know, in a sense. You know, this wonderful phrase of Marx, you know, the theoretician of the senses. You know, we're still prehistory because we have not developed the senses. So in some ways, this is, again, another revolutionary book, even though they don't put it out in terms of those kind of terms, but it is an attempt to overcome, right, how the senses have been formed, how they've been conditioned, right? How do we, again, break this open in a sense, right? This kind of new sensuous, and not reason, but sensuous lines of flight as well. You know,
exactly.
It's crazy to be in these buildings in New York City. You're insane to go to work in an office. If you really think about it, you're insane to go into a building that's, you know, with airflows, ventilation, and most of these midtown buildings. Insane to go there 9 to 5 every day. But you do so because of the conditions of your existence. You know, you need to make a living, or you need to do this. But when you think about it in terms of your senses and your sensual, you know, yeah, etc.
And but in fact, but even you know, and the question today,
very basic,
the question of servility, whether it's then within the family, the workplace, and so on and so forth, it is precisely always has to do with institutionalization, normalization, ultimately, because take the family also. The family seen as body, right? Like, you know, even my own body is a field of explosive or so many things. The family, the same. I mean, the affection in the family, of course, usually is great, but two other bodies made of so many different moments and fragments and divisions there too. It is the institutionalization of the family with the Oedipalization that they are ultimately also not attacking, not the fact that one has you know, real relationships with others, right? So, but the question today, to overcome also, if you will, servility, servitude, is first of all to start thinking, right? I mean, people, we know, I mean, we don't think, right? I mean, of course, even in being bold, we should be bold, but we should also be cautious and not say something that makes no sense whatsoever. Right? I mean, things had to make sense, but sense itself, meaning itself, must be transformed. So that's a lot of work. I mean, in practice, there is a lot of work that we had to do, right? So, but this is what I think they are doing. What they are maybe, you know, maybe starting at the reference to people like Antonin Artaud and so on and so forth. That's the meaning of that, right? I mean, to look in to the possibility of an alternative, if you will. I don't particularly like the word meaning, right? To go, you know, and occupy the space of the threshold, which is the space just after the limit, right? They speak about this as well. Is this possible, you know, to change, to transform? It is possible, why not? So, but the question is how.
So there's so many things that have just been raised. Again, I think I'm going to be the skeptic here a little bit, and that I mean, you know, Bruno, sort of like, you know, a friendly counter to that. I mean, again, the problem I see is that if you couch it in those terms, like, you know, to radically transform who we are, to radically remake, to question everything. I guess, you know, this is probably just, you know, to some degree a difference in perspective, but, you know, my work as a political economist and looking at economic systems. And, you know, I think one of the things that a lesson of Marx is his materiality, and that there is an enduring structure that exists that I think it's, you know, what they're getting at is that it's also reproduced within our psychological apparatus. It's also external, and there are real materialities and there are real constraints. So I think that this idea of just sort of, you know, this radical, you know, like I like if you think about, you know, these concepts, how would you make these concepts relevant to a woman living in Arkansas with 2 kids trying to survive? I mean, like in
I tell her to go see my friend Andre Koduskro at his farm and read some poetry together, and then maybe her life would change. Yeah, I'm just,
right, but I'm saying that there are sort of a lot of things.
That's not where they're. Yeah,
there's sort of like this grand revolutionary gesture, right? That we're going to move beyond capitalism.
Well,
but I think that this gets back to what Lydia was saying. Also, is that how do you actually make this in some sense real? How do you actually transform this into a pragmatics?
Well, maybe.
You're talking about a kind of pragmatics. I mean, we can talk about in the abstract, transformation is possible, but when we look at the actual attempts in real history, the things that we have evidence of, in fact, it actually looks like transformation is incredibly difficult. And when you enter into the realm of real politics, I mean, Michael, you've been referencing this, but there's reasons why unions are so limited and constrained in what they do. And when you enter into the realm of real union struggles as they currently exist, there are political constraints, operative constraints that make it very hard to, think of the schizoid, line of flight outside of capitalist wage labor. I mean, getting free of capital.
Well, let's look at the liberal imagination. What is the film that wins the Academy Award?
But
just think about this today. What is going on in terms of the signifiers that are playing out in so-called dominant culture? Right, nomad land. Right. Think about this, though. In a sense, what is going on right now in terms of the dominant Hollywood culture and what's being transmitted here about capital flows and all of this at this point? I mean, this is liberal imagination. This is not not high-powered, abstract communist imagination at work. What are they playing on right now?
I don't know. I don't.
Yeah. I mean, she wins an Academy Award. It wins the Academy Award for Best Film. The year before, Parasite wins about class warfare. I mean, yeah. So in a sense, what are we doing now? What's happening in a sense? I mean, this appropriation of the nomad 50 years later. What kind of codes are playing out? How has it been recodified? And where are we? We're in a pandemic. We're about ready to become, all bots, if you will. Homo datum, as our friend Arto Artinian likes to say. We're now, the species is data, no longer desiring production, but we're desiring datum now, right? In a sense, this is the new morph in a sense. And yes, I mean, I mean, how do we deal with this? How do we update all this in a sense to see what's coming down? Yeah. I mean, so you want to speak to the average person? Yes, you have nomad land. Talk about,
But let me just raise this point, then I'll let other people. But again, what I'm talking about is also a level of materiality. I mean, in my opinion, what we can draw from Marx is transcending capital is transcending wage labor, and
transcending
what wage labor?
Moving beyond, that.
Right.
Beyond wage labor. And
Joseph had a great comment. They had no nomads, right?
And finding the different way to organize and allocate the social division of labor and the technical division of labor. I mean, that's fundamental. You cannot talk about social transformation without dealing at that level. You can't. I mean, so that's more like the materiality.
But what Deleuze and Guattari would reply to this, just based on what we've read? They would say, yeah, of course we agree with you, but look at how the party has failed. Where's the party that goes in to organize these people? Why is it that there's a union failure in Bessemer, Alabama, which was basically a communist stronghold in Alabama politics, et cetera? Why is this happening? This is what they would ask you, in a sense. Where's the organization? what's going on about this? Why are we having, these massive transformations? And again, why do people choose not to join a union that might have been better in Amazon, and instead they buy that Amazon, I'm making $15 an hour here, I only make $8 as a and really talk. For free of wage labor, but the same time, what they're bringing back into the
people not join unions, or why my bias is that we need to look at the material conditions of everyday life and how people confront the choices that are available to them, and the way in which choices become very constrained. And I think that would give us more insight both into why people actually do what they do, but also I think it potentially opens up a more practical way of trying to think about, well, how
because even the example of the woman in Arkansas and so on and so forth. Yeah, of course. But the question is why, is there this situation whereby sadness, I used to think sadness is the structure of the world. In a sense, I still do. However, in addition to sadness, there is also, and Spinoza speaks of this, in the spectrum of the passions, you have sadness, you have joy. Sadness is the result of a decrease of power as potency, not political power, ontological power. And joy is the result of an increase of power, the power to act, to do things. And the power to act is linked intimately to the power to think. So that's really the change that must be brought about. That we need to start thinking again, acting again, and going in the right direction, so that we can move from sadness to, if anything, to joy, to liberated time, to go back to Marx, the Marx of the Grundrisse, disposable time, right? For meaningful activities, for a meaningful life. I don't know, maybe this is kind of utopian in a sense, might be in the good sense. There is a very good sense of utopia.
But why wouldn't we always think of this in terms of energy and time?
Yeah.
Right? This is really the issue here to me. Yeah. When people talk about, Josepha just put in the chat, yes, of course, desire is material production. Yeah, desire, again, for them, in a sense, the materiality of energy is really at stake here. Right, for them. They really think that somehow the flow itself, the reason for the language of the flow is because of the lack, that somehow is always privilege there. They don't see it as lack. They see this as abundance, right, in a way. This is really about abundance and excess, in a sense, in a certain way. There's no need for lack and castration at this point. I don't think that's a utopic. That is the way the earth and nature are operating, right? The abundance, right? The problem is the institutions in what's being shared here. There's a stripping away of all this that they're doing. I think that's very interesting, very careful and interesting. Sloppy at times, I agree. There's times they'll go over there. Listen, I'm sure that if you put them in a room with psychoanalysts, there's going to be a back and forth and a lot of yelling and argumentation, etc. A lot of rivalry, a lot of, transference, countertransference going on all in the room all at once. But at the same time, they're carefully trying to, I think, destroy, right, the institutionalization, normalization, these kind of forms that have created these new techniques, if you will, of servitude. These new techniques that are no longer just ideological apparatuses or frameworks, but techniques that are actually used in the world. They're pragmatics of servitude. How you keep this going. And this is why the term police is, becomes a kind of all-encompassing term in a way, that they're not interested in thought police. They're not interested in the actual police. And, they're always looking for these lines of lights, these exits. Yeah.
So is the way you were talking, thinking like maybe, the link here is that, what you said was interesting, that the link between getting to servitude is lack, and I think that this is also kind of what you were saying, Bruno, in a way, and that maybe what the way in which servitude is currently reproduced is how lack is introduced into subjectivity.
Well, consumerism works on lack. Think about the sphere of consumption. How does the sphere of consumption actually work? It works on lack, right? It doesn't work on, fulfillment or,
But there may even be more
people get depressed, they go shopping, right? The first thing they do, right?
More complex.
It's gonna make me feel better. The new dress, the new pair of pants, the new this or whatever. You know the story. We go through it in our everyday lives with our friends and our partners or whatever. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I go by jazz records. That's my.
Well, I'm very happy to hear that. Yeah, that's very.
Oh
good.
yeah, I wanted to tell you. We spoke about this.
But
okay.
That's I think the simplest manifestation, but there may be more complex manifestations of how that lack then is transformed into the desire for authority and almost a pleasure in the subordination to authority. And
well,
so
then, again, the question is, what is pleasure then? Again, is it being produced in the sphere of consumption? Do we think it's that, or is it actual pleasure?
Well,
That's another thing that is a question here too, in terms of, Freud, of course, has this running dichotomy that Marcuse rewrites in Eros and Civilization between the reality principle and the pleasure principle. If you read,
Freud talks about masochistic pleasure.
Of course.
Again, I think it's,
I understand the depth of all this.
So I'm just, thinking out loud a little bit that maybe kind of the link I'm looking for anyway is in this, the notion of lack, and then how that is produced, and then how that the subject attempts to resolve that lack in a way that ends up desiring a certain kind of subordination, and that almost becomes, receives a pleasure in it. That the, the subordination, something like that maybe is, because again, I see a missing link in what they're doing.
Fair enough. I mean, let's see if we can find that missing link as we discussed. I'm fine with it.
That are going on, and they're not mediated or conjoined. The transmissions between them are. Yeah, so that's interesting. I wonder what Lydia would say to the notion of lack.
Lydia probably went to cook dinner, but anyway, no late dinner.
Phased out. What's it about lack?
Oh yeah, we'll come back.
Lydia, you're the expert on lack. Okay,
Lack that's okay.
Yeah, and good. All right. Well, I mean, I guess we could call, unless, David, you have something to say. I mean, it was a very good beginning to this. I know we don't really, answer the question in a sense. We create more of them and then go back to the text. But anything else? I mean, I really taken by your reading of the Melville, that section. Very beautiful, and you really should do something with that. I mean, we have a lot of thieves in this audience, so go ahead and work with that.
Well, there's sort of a question for Carl, which is, as someone in political economy, a few classes back, we were looking a little bit at the concept of ressentiment. And a patient of mine was making the observation about the events of January 6th, that so many of the people in it really are kind of in the middle class. If not even wealthier than that. Like, there was a group from Texas who jetted in on a private jet to go to this. A lot of retired police people or fire people who do have, relatively decent pensions. They're not quite the phenomenon of Weimar Germany, feeling so desperately starving that, that they wanted a Hitler or something like that. I was curious your take on what you were getting at about the real sort of structural conditions. What you think from an economic point of view in the United States would drive maybe the defense of ressentiment going waywards, where it's not like these people really do want to kill Trump. They got sort of diverted a little bit to maybe killing Pence, but it feels like there's an experience of them being pushed out. They don't have the same white supremacy. They don't have the same job security, whatever it may be. But Carl, your take on why this maybe is going away from a potential revolution?
I would really have to think about that. I mean, that's the $1 million question. That I would have to think about that. Mm-hmm. I don't have an immediate answer to that. Right. That's
I think it's important, though, to remember that Marx is doing a critique of political economy. Marx is not a political economist, right? He is doing a critique of it. He's laying bare the structure of political economy. And what Bruno mentioned about real wealth is really what Marx is about, right? Ultimately, after value and exchange values and wage slavery is really taken apart and done with. So, Marx is always involved in critique. That's what communism really means, is the real movement of the critique. It's a relentless critique that does not stop. That is its theoretical armature. That is its weapon, right, in a sense. You know, then you get into questions, you know, where we're trying to go here of organization and what happened. And, you know, I mean, one of the moments was really about how well organized militarily the Bolsheviks were. That's why they were able to take power, or Castro in the hills and all these kind of things. But really in the original movement, it's about movement, right? The movement of this critique that does not let up. And I think Anti-Oedipus is really on that model. They've modeled themselves on that kind of, you know, practice. And remember, this is like baby in the, this is like, you know, pablum to these people in France that are educated in certain ways. They grow up on Marx. It's not like here where you may get it in college if you're lucky, right? And you may read one book, or you may hear the name or something like that. This is when these people are in school after World War II. Marx is very much in the curriculum, right? You know, capital is everyday life, right? Yeah, in many ways. In fact, Freud is not as much everyday life as one would think. You know. Yeah.
No, that's. I actually need to get off soon.
Yeah, sure.
But you know what I was going to say about, you know, Marx was the critique of political economy, and then there's also a critical political economy. And there's a big debate. You know, did he get too trapped in understanding the logics of capital? But you know, he wrote an enormous amount trying to actually explain how capitalism is reproduced. I mean, that's a huge aspect of his work. So I think he operates on both a lot of different levels.
Right.
Let me say this.
We're always finding two Marx. They always find like the humanist Marx or the anti-humanist Marx. So this Marx, the class struggle Marx or the structuralist Marx. There's always like the split in Marx. And I think, you know, it's like, it's because he's sort of doing all these things simultaneously. I think that's part of what's interesting about it. So.
Right.
Thank
So
you.
let me just say for next week, why don't we pick up on this introduction and try to get to the tasks as well. And I'll put this in the thing, and I will, you know, talk about the relationship Spinoza and Nietzsche, especially here, to this work, you know, that's also going on behind the surfaces, even though there's many more references to Nietzsche and less to Spinoza. I think Spinoza is certainly playing out in terms of the body without organs, or organs with bodies, as I like to invert it in some ways.
Are you going to do the Saussure Gemslev?
Yeah, I don't know.
That's what I was hoping
do
for.
That the third week. I owe that. I owe that to you. Yeah. I don't know.